The dead do not speak, but they leave echoes in the places they once inhabited. For Alex, these echoes had become an obsession, a desperate search for a whisper in the void. The project was born from a silence that was too loud to bear, the silence that followed the loss of a sister, a vibrant soul extinguished too soon. That profound absence had shattered Alex's comfortable, rational world, leaving behind a fissure through which the impossible now seemed to peer. If a person could simply vanish, what else might be true? What lingered in the shadows we were all taught to dismiss? This quest was not for the faint of heart, nor for the true believer. Alex approached it as a skeptic, armed with a methodology designed to dissect the supernatural with the cold, sharp tools of science. The plan was to document 24 of the world's most infamous haunted houses, a journey into the heart of folklore and fear. The equipment was state-of-the-art digital voice recorders to capture electronic voice phenomena, full-spectrum cameras to see beyond the visible light spectrum, and electromagnetic field meters to log fluctuations that often accompanied reported activity. A laser thermometer would track the sudden, inexplicable cold spots that were the ghost's calling card. Every piece of data would be logged, every sensation cross-referenced. This was to be a systematic autopsy of the afterlife. Yet, for all the technological armor, the journey was intensely personal. Packing the van for the first leg of the trip, Alex felt the weight of a dual purpose. On one hand, it was a documentary project, a potential book or series that would appeal to those with a taste for the macabre. On the other, it was a pilgrimage. Each location was a question mark, a potential doorway. If just one of these houses could offer a shred of undeniable evidence, it would be a balm for a grief that had festered into a relentless, aching doubt. The initial plan was clinical, but the hope driving it was raw and human. The first destination was already plotted on the map, a name whispered with reverence and dread in paranormal circles. But before that, there was only the open road and the quiet hum of the van-S engine, a solitary vessel carrying its lone occupant toward the unknown. Alex's fingers tightened on the steering wheel, the familiar streets of home giving way to the sprawling anonymity of the motorway. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a beautiful, ordinary phenomenon that felt like a farewell to the world of the ordinary. Doubt was a constant passenger in the seat beside Alex. The rational mind, so carefully cultivated over years of investigative work, fought a rearguard action against this newfound desperation. It whispered that cold spots were drafts, that shadows were tricks of the light, and that the human brain was wired to find patterns, even in random noise. It was a voice that argued for the comfort of the known, for the finality of the grave. But another, quieter voice, born in a hospital room that had grown terribly still, asked a single persistent question: what if? That question was the engine of the entire endeavor. It was the reason Alex would spend nights in dusty attics and damp cellars, listening for a sound that had no source. It was the reason for the meticulous notes, the hours of audio review, the endless patience. This was not a hunt for monsters, but a search for a sign that the silence was not absolute, that the light of a loved one could not be so completely, so mercilessly snuffed out. As the miles stretched out behind, Alex felt the first tremors of anticipation and fear, a cocktail of emotions that would become a familiar companion. The journey into the unknown had begun, driven by a loss that refused to be quiet and a hope that refused to die. The Essex countryside unfolded like a patchwork quilt of muted greens and browns, a serene landscape that belied the dark reputation of the place Alex was seeking. Borley Rectory had long held the title of the most haunted house in England, a crumbling monument to sorrow and spectral rumour. The journey ended not at the rectory itself, which had been destroyed by fire decades prior, but at the site where its foundations still scarred the earth, and the adjacent churchyard where its stories were kept alive. The air was still and heavy, the only sound the distant cawing of rooks from a cluster of skeletal trees. An elderly man, the self-appointed keeper of the local law, was tending to the church grounds. His name was Mr. Hempstead, and his eyes held a knowing glint as he saw Alex's equipment-laden approach. He leaned on his rake, not as a prop, but as if for support against the weight of the tales he carried. He spoke of the rectory's troubled past, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to blend with the whisper of the wind through the yew trees. He told of the phantom nun, the most persistent of the rectory's ghosts, a sorrowful figure forever doomed to walk the grounds. Her origin was a tapestry of local legend, a star-crossed romance with a monk from a nearby monastery, their elopement ending in tragedy and murder. For over a century, she had been seen gliding along the old carriage drive, a silent, black-habited spectre haunting the periphery of the living world. Mr. Hempstead's stories were not just of sightings, but of phenomena. He spoke of bells ringing with no one to pull the ropes, of windows shattering from the inside out, and of the heavy, dragging footsteps that echoed through empty halls. He recounted the tales of previous inhabitants, driven to distraction by the relentless activity, their lives unraveled by the unseen forces that infested the house. Alex listened, recording the conversation, the skeptic's mind cataloguing each anecdote as folklore, yet the investigator's intuition prickling with a nascent curiosity. The personal tragedy that fueled this quest made these stories of lost love and eternal penance resonate with a deeper, more painful frequency. Finally, with the old man's blessings and directions, Alex approached the site of the rectory itself. Little remained but a few low walls and the outline of the foundation, a ghost of a ghost house. The air grew perceptibly colder, a sharp contrast to the mild afternoon sun. Stepping across the threshold where the front door once stood was like passing through an invisible membrane. The atmosphere changed instantly, becoming thick and charged with a watchful silence. The cheerful birdsong from the churchyard faded, replaced by an oppressive quiet that seemed to swallow all sound. Then the whispers began. They were not loud, nor were they clear enough to discern words. They were sibilant echoes, like pages of a Bible rustling in a distant room, or the faint, desperate murmurs of a prayer. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, swirling around Alex on the still air. The rational mind suggested the wind, or the rustle of leaves, but there was no wind, and the leaves were still. This was a sound that existed in the space between the ears and the world, a psychic intrusion more than an auditory one. Turning slowly, Alex's gaze fell upon the heavy oak door of the church vestry which connected to the rectory site. It was a door Mr. Hempstead had pointed out, mentioning it was always kept locked. As Alex watched, the iron bolt, thick with rust and age, began to slide back with a grating screech that tore through the silence. It moved not with a human hand, but with a deliberate, unseen force. With a final, resonant clunk, the bolt slid fully open, and the door groaned inward on its heavy hinges, revealing the dark, cool interior of the vestry beyond. The opening was an invitation, or a challenge, from the silence itself. Alex stood frozen on the rectory's spectral doorstep, the line between folklore and tangible experience blurring into nothingness. The investigation had truly begun, and the phantom nun had announced her presence not with an apparition, but with an unlocked door and a chorus of whispers. A glacial breath of air coiled around Alex's ankles the moment they stepped through the open vestry door, a cold so sharp and sudden it felt like stepping into a subterranean stream. The warmth of the Essex afternoon vanished, replaced by a damp, penetrating chill that had no logical source. The air within the old stone building was stale and carried the scent of dust and decaying hymnals, yet beneath it, a new fragrance began to weave through the gloom, the faint, cloying sweetness of old-fashioned perfume, like lavender and rosewater left to curdle with time. Alex's fingers, clumsy with the cold, fumbled for the laser thermometer. The digital display confirmed the impossible. The temperature in the center of the room had plummeted a full 15 degrees from the air just outside the door. Driven by a compulsion that overrode the primal urge to flee, Alex moved deeper into the hallway that connected the vestry to the remnants of the rectory. The beam of the flashlight cut a wavering path through the oppressive dark, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the agitated air. The whispers had not ceased, they had merely changed, coalescing into a single rhythmic sound, a soft metallic scrape and drag, like a heavy chain being pulled across a stone floor somewhere just out of sight. The sound seemed to echo from the very walls, a mournful percussion to the nun's legendary penance. Alex's recorder was running, its red light a tiny, steady eye in the gloom, capturing the unnerving audio of a phantom burden. Then, at the far end of the hallway, where the shadows were deepest, a patch of darkness detached itself from the rest. It was not a trick of the light, it was a solid, human-shaped void that absorbed the flashlight's beam rather than reflecting it. The figure was tall and slender, draped in what could only be the long, flowing habit of a nun. It did not walk, but seemed to glide, a silent black smudge against the darker black of the corridor. A wave of pure, undiluted fear washed over Alex, so potent it was a physical sensation, a tightening in the chest and a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. This was no longer a story told by an old man in a churchyard. This was a presence. For a long, heart-stopping moment, the figure paused, its form seeming to turn, though it had no discernible face to direct. A feeling of profound sorrow and desperate longing poured from it, an emotional residue so strong it felt like a physical weight in the air. Alex's skepticism, that carefully constructed fortress of rationality, crumbled in an instant. This was not data. This was an encounter. The breath caught in their throat, every muscle tensed for flight. The phantom nun lingered for only a few seconds more before dissolving back into the shadows from which it had come, leaving behind only the lingering scent of perfume and the fading echo of dragging chains. The fear did not leave with the apparition. It stayed, coiling in Alex's stomach as they stood alone in the silent, frigid hallway. The clinical mission to document and debunk felt trivial, almost sacrilegious, in the wake of such a direct and emotional experience. This was not a puzzle to be solved, but a tragedy being witnessed. The nun was not a ghost story, she was a person, or the echo of one, trapped in an endless loop of grief. Alex's own loss, the quiet agony that had launched this entire quest, rose to the surface, mirroring the sorrow they had just perceived. The line between investigator and subject had blurred irrevocably. Packing up the equipment with trembling hands, Alex knew that Borley Rectory had given them exactly what they had come for, not proof for the world, but a terrifying personal confirmation that the silence of death was not always empty. The most enduring ghosts are not those of sound, but of sight. A single, indelible image burned into the collective memory of a place. For Raynham Hall, that image was of a woman in a brocade dress, the color of aged parchment, forever descending the grand staircase. Her face a mask of tragedy, and her eyes two dark, hollow voids. The Brown Lady. Her legend was not one of whispers or cold drafts, but of a silent, chilling tableau, a portrait that moved. Alex arrived in Norfolk with the phantom nun's sorrow still clinging to them, a fresh layer of sensitivity over their raw nerves. The clinical detachment they had once prized was now a tattered cloak, and the stories of the Brown Lady felt more like a premonition than a case file. The research began in the local archives and the quiet pubs where old families gathered. The story of Dorothy Walpole, sister of Britain's first Prime Minister, was a sordid tale of aristocratic cruelty. Married to the Viscount Townsend, she was allegedly locked away within Raynham Hall for her infidelities, dying of starvation and despair within its opulent walls. Her spirit, it was said, refused to rest, forever pacing the home that had been her gilded cage. But it was the descriptions from those who claimed to have seen her that captivated Alex most. They did not speak of a blur or a mist, but of a solid, tangible figure, her dress rustling with the sound of silk, her face bearing an expression of profound sadness. And always they mentioned the eyes, not just dark but empty, as if the sockets led to an infinite starless night. Alex interviewed a former housemaid, a woman now in her 80s whose hands still trembled slightly as she poured the tea. She spoke of a night in the 1960s when she had been tasked with fetching something from the long gallery. She had seen the Brown Lady on the staircase, not as a fleeting shadow, but standing perfectly still, one hand resting on the banister as if paused mid-descent. The maid described a coldness that had nothing to do with the draughty hall, a deep, soul-chilling cold that had rooted her to the spot. The figure had then turned its head, and the maid had found herself staring into those hollow eyes. She had not screamed, she said. The terror was too complete for sound. She had simply backed away, quit her position the next morning, and never set foot in the hall again. Another witness, a photographer who had worked at the hall in the 1980s, recounted a similar experience. He had been setting up a shot of the famous staircase when the air grew heavy and still. He had looked up, and there she was, several steps up, gazing down at him. He described the same paralyzing cold and the overwhelming sense of being in the presence of a deep, timeless grief. He had fumbled with his camera, but by the time he had steadied his hands, the apparition had vanished, leaving only the echo of its despair. These first-hand accounts transformed the brown lady from a folk tale into a specific, documented phenomenon. The consistency of the descriptions, the detailed dress, the hollow eyes, the penetrating cold, was unlike the vague, shifting stories that often surrounded hauntings. This was a ghost with a fixed identity and a repeatable performance. Armed with these testimonies, Alex secured permission for an initial exploration of Raynham Hall. Stepping into the grand entrance hall was like walking into a different century. Portraits of stern-faced Townsends looked down from panelled walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow Alex's movements. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and old wood. The focal point, the magnificent oak staircase, swept upwards in a graceful curve, its polished banister a dark ribbon against the pale stone. Alex's equipment was set up with a practiced efficiency, but the routine felt different now, more reverent. As they began to take baseline readings at the foot of the stairs, a profound stillness settled over the hall. The gentle ticking of a long case clock in the corner seemed to slow, its rhythm, faltering. Then it happened. A wave of cold so intense it felt like a physical blow washed down the staircase. It was not a draft from a window or a door, it was a contained, localized pocket of frigid air that flowed with purpose. The laser thermometer's reading plummeted, the numbers dropping faster than the device could logically register. The cold seeped through Alex's jacket, raising goosebumps on their arms and sending an involuntary shiver down their spine. It was the same cold the housemaid and the photographer had described, a cold that came from nowhere and carried with it the weight of centuries of sorrow. The grand hall, for all its opulence, suddenly felt like a mausoleum. The brown lady had not yet shown herself, but her signature had been left in the air, a cold and unmistakable calling card. The cold was not merely an absence of warmth, but a presence in itself, a viscous, heavy air that clung to the skin and seeped into the bones. It pooled at the base of the grand staircase, a silent, freezing lake of atmosphere that seemed to emanate from the steps themselves. Alex's breath misted in the beam of the flashlight, the only movement in the otherwise paralyzed air of the entrance hall. The initial shock of the temperature drop had subsided, replaced by a heightened, razor-sharp awareness. Every sense was tuned to the frequency of the place, to the lingering sorrow of Dorothy Walpole. The grand staircase, that beautiful, sweeping curve of oak, was no longer just an architectural feature. It was a stage, and the play was centuries old. Setting up the tripod with deliberate, careful movements, Alex aimed the full-spectrum camera upward, framing the staircase in its viewfinder. The camera was a silent sentinel, its unblinking eye capable of seeing what human vision could not. The only sound was the soft whir of the device as it began to capture a series of long exposure shots, each one a prolonged stare into the gloom of the upper landing. The first few frames revealed nothing but the empty steps and the dark, oiled gleam of the banister. Then, on the fifth exposure, something materialized. It was not a figure, not yet. It was a patch of luminous, swirling mist, a coalescence of ectoplasmic vapor that hung in the air halfway up the staircase. It had no defined shape, but it pulsed with a faint internal light, a will-o'-the-wisp born of anguish rather than marsh gas. Alex's heart hammered against their ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. The camera had captured what the eyes had not yet seen, a tangible anomaly, a physical manifestation of the hall's haunted energy. As Alex stared at the camera's display, a new sound began to bleed into the silence. It was the soft, measured tread of footsteps on the staircase. They were not the heavy, confident steps of a living person, but something far more ethereal, a whisper of weight on wood, the faint rustle of fabric accompanying each footfall. The sound descended from the top of the stairs, growing slowly, inexorably closer. It was the sound of a dress brushing against ankles, of a ghostly foot testing each step in a descent that had been repeated for over 200 years. Alex's gaze snapped from the camera screen to the staircase itself, but the steps remained empty. The sound, however, was undeniably real, a haunting auditory hallucination that was as clear and present as their own breathing. A profound and personal dread began to uncoil in the pit of Alex's stomach. This was no longer the detached fear of an investigator witnessing a phenomenon. This was the visceral, gut-wrenching terror of being prey. The sensation of being watched was so intense it felt like a physical pressure between the shoulder blades. It was a predatory attention, a focused gaze from the empty eyes described in every account. Alex could feel it emanating from the swirling mist on the stairs, a consciousness aware of their intrusion, observing their every twitch and breath. The grand hall, with its portraits and its history, seemed to shrink, the walls closing in. They were not just documenting a ghost, they were sharing a space with it, and it knew they were there. The soft footsteps reached the midpoint of the staircase and paused. The swirling mist in the camera's viewfinder seemed to solidify for a fraction of a second, hinting at a human form, a shoulder, the curve of a skirt, before dissolving back into incoherent light. The feeling of being watched intensified into a nearly unbearable weight. It was a moment of pure existential vulnerability, a confrontation with an intelligence from beyond the veil. Alex stood frozen, caught between the urge to flee and the desperate need to witness, to capture the final, undeniable proof. But in that heart-stopping silence, beneath the gaze of the unseen brown lady, the quest for proof felt trivial. This was an experience that would be carved into memory, an unforgettable scar of dread that reinforced one chilling truth. Some hauntings are not just stories to be recorded, but presences to be endured. Some places are not haunted by a single ghost, but by the accumulated agony of centuries, a psychic scar upon the land that weeps eternally. Chillingham Castle did not whisper of romance or lost love. It screamed of pain. Its very stones, weathered and grim, seemed to have absorbed the brutality of its history, radiating a palpable sense of dread that clung to the air like a foul miasma. For Alex, still raw from the intimate sorrows of Borley and Raynham, the approach to this Northumbrian fortress felt like stepping from a graveyard into an abattoir. The castle's silhouette was a jagged tear in the grey sky, a monument not to nobility, but to the savage exercise of power and the countless souls broken within its walls. The history of Chillingham was a litany of violence, meticulously recorded in ledgers that detailed its use as a staging post during border wars with Scotland. But it was the tales of the dungeon that formed the dark heart of its legend. This was not a place of honourable imprisonment, but a purpose-built chamber of horrors, a cramped, lightless oubliette where enemies of the English crown were subjected to unimaginable torment. Alex spent the morning in the castle's library, their fingers tracing the cold, precise script in account books that listed expenses for manacles, for the rack, and for the disposal of bodies. The words were dry and administrative, which made the horrors they described all the more chilling. These were not ghost stories, they were receipts for suffering. The guide, a woman with a somber demeanor that perfectly matched her surroundings, spoke not with the relish of a showman, but with the grim duty of a coroner. She described the whipping table, a stone slab to which prisoners were strapped for lashings, its surface still stained dark with a patina that could never be scrubbed away. She pointed out the tiny, airless cells where men were left to starve and go mad in the absolute dark, their only company the scurrying of rats and the screams of others. She saved the most harrowing detail for the dungeon's centerpiece, a pit known as the Dead Hole, where the deceased and the dying were unceremoniously dumped, their bodies left to rot in a communal grave. The air in the library grew thick and heavy as she spoke, as if the stories themselves were leaching the oxygen from the room. When the time came to descend into the dungeon, Alex felt a profound reluctance, a primal warning that screamed against entering such a place. The narrow, spiraling stone staircase was a descent into the earth's cold belly, each step taking them further from the world of the living. The air grew damp and frigid, carrying the unmistakable metallic scent of old iron and the faint, sweetish odor of decay, a ghost of a smell that had no physical source. The oppressive energy was immediate and overwhelming, a suffocating blanket of despair that pressed in from all sides. It was not the focused sorrow of the brown lady, but a chaotic, screaming chorus of lost and broken minds. The dungeon itself was a vision of hell. The low, vaulted ceiling seemed to crush down upon them, and the walls were rough, damp stone, scarred with the frantic scratches of fingernails. In the beam of the flashlight, the whipping table stood as a stark, brutal altar. Alex's equipment reacted instantly. The EMF meter spiked erratically, and the temperature dropped so sharply that their breath plumed in great white clouds. But it was the sounds that truly unraveled them. At first it was a low, collective moan, a vibration more than a noise, rising from the very stones. Then, individual threads of suffering began to emerge from the chorus, a choked gasp from the corner, where a man had suffocated, a wet, rattling cough from near the pit, the soft, hopeless weeping of someone who had given up all hope. These were not the clear, almost theatrical sounds of Borley. These were the raw, visceral noises of human beings in their final, most animalistic moments of agony. Alex's clinical resolve shattered completely. Standing in that pit of despair, surrounded by the echoes of centuries of torture, they were no longer an investigator. They were a witness. A deep, aching empathy swelled in their chest, a connection to this multitude of lost souls that was more profound than any they had yet felt. Their own personal grief, the engine of this entire quest, felt small and clean compared to this filthy, overwhelming ocean of pain. The tortured souls of Chillingham did not want to be documented, they demanded to be remembered, and in the deafening silence that followed the fading moans, Alex knew they would carry the memory of this place and its broken chorus for the rest of their life. Leaving the dungeon felt like a physical ascent from the underworld, each step up the spiral staircase a struggle against the clinging despair that seemed to grasp at Alex's ankles. The relative brightness of the castle's main level was no comfort. The normalcy felt false, a thin veneer over the rot festering below. The guide, her face a mask of solemn understanding, suggested they see the upper rooms, places where the castle's spectral residents were said to be less violent but no less present. Alex agreed. Their nerves frayed but their resolve hardened. The investigation had become something more than a collection of data. It was now a bearing of witness. The first upper chamber was a long gallery, its walls lined with portraits of stern-faced nobles whose painted eyes seemed to follow Alex's progress with cold indifference. Sunlight streamed through the tall leaded windows, illuminating dancing dust motes, yet the room held pockets of profound cold that defied the warmth of the day. Moving through the space was like wading through an invisible river, the temperature shifting from comfortable to bone-chilling in the space of a single step. The laser thermometer confirmed these anomalies. Islands of frigid air, 10 to 15 degrees colder than their surroundings, with no draft or open window to explain them. In one such spot, near a heavy tapestry depicting a hunting scene, Alex felt a sudden dizzying wave of nausea, a visceral reaction to an unseen presence that felt both ancient and deeply sad. In the corner of their eye, shadows began to dance. At first, they were fleeting, peripheral smudges that vanished when looked at directly, the classic tricks of a tired mind in a strange place. But soon, they grew bolder. A dark shape darted from behind a high-backed chair, a swift, human-like silhouette that dissolved into the panelled wall. Another seemed to flit across the far end of the gallery, a patch of concentrated darkness moving with purpose, before evaporating into nothingness. These were not the defined, sorrowful figure of the nun or the chilling tableau of the brown lady. These were flickers of residual energy, echoes of lives lived and lost within these stone walls, impressions left upon the very fabric of the castle. The final stop was a small, unassuming bedroom, sparsely furnished with a simple bed and a wooden chest. The guide's voice grew softer here, almost a whisper, as she began to tell the story of the room's most frequent visitor, a young child. Her name, according to legend, was Mary, a little girl who had died of a fever centuries ago, and who was often seen or heard crying for her mother. The guide described the times nursery rhymes had been heard sung in an empty room, the faint sound of a child's laughter echoing down the corridor, and the small, cold hand that visitors sometimes felt clutching theirs in the dark. As the guide spoke of the child's loneliness, her eternal search for a comfort that would never come, something broke inside Alex. The story was simple, devoid of the graphic horror of the dungeon, yet it struck with a far more personal and devastating force. It was not the grand tragedy of a noblewoman or the tortured prisoner, but the quiet, universal heartbreak of a lost child. A choked sob escaped Alex's lips before they could stop it, and hot tears welled in their eyes, blurring the sparse room. It was an involuntary, visceral reaction, a dam of professional detachment finally giving way under the weight of accumulated grief, both the castle's and their own. The image of their own lost sister, vibrant and young, superimposed itself over the story of the phantom child, and the pain was a physical ache, a raw, open wound. The guide fell silent, her story complete, her expression one of quiet empathy. In that moment, standing in the room of a ghostly child, weeping for a loss both personal and historical, Alex's connection to Chillingham Castle was sealed. It was no longer just another location on a list, a place of phenomena to be logged and analyzed. It had become a repository of human suffering, from the brutal agony of the dungeon to the poignant sorrow of a lonely child. The castle's stones held not just ghosts, but the entire terrible spectrum of loss. Wiping the tears away, Alex felt a strange sense of peace amidst the sorrow. The quest had begun as a search for proof of an afterlife, but here, in the upper rooms of Chillingham, it had transformed into something deeper, a profound emotional communion with the echoes of the dead. There are places where the haunting is not a person, but a presence, a formless, malevolent intelligence that seeks not to be seen, but to be felt in the slow unraveling of the mind. For Alex, still carrying the emotional weight of Chillingham's tortured chorus, the next destination promised a different kind of fear. 50 Berkeley Square was not known for a specific ghost, a weeping woman, or a headless horseman. Its legend was far more insidious. It was known as the most haunted house in London, not for its apparitions, but for its entity, a thing of pure terror that was said to drive those who encountered it to the brink of insanity, or over it. This was not a search for a sorrowful spirit, but an investigation into the nature of fear itself. The London townhouse, nestled in an affluent Mayfair square, presented a facade of elegant normalcy. Its 4 stories of pale stucco and neat black railings stood in quiet dignity, belying the darkness festering within. There were no crumbling stones or Gothic towers here. The horror was contained, polished, and civilized. Alex's research in the city's archives and paranormal libraries unearthed a chilling pattern. The house's history was a catalogue of abrupt departures and shattered lives. A previous resident, a Mr. Myers, had fled in the dead of night, leaving all his possessions behind, and was later found in a pauper's asylum, babbling incoherently about a formless horror that had stalked him through the rooms. 2 sailors, seeking shelter for the night in the then vacant house, were discovered the next morning. One had died of sheer fright, his face frozen in a rictus of terror, while the other spent the rest of his life in a mental institution, forever broken by what he had witnessed. These were not tales of a visual spectre. Witnesses, the few who could speak of it, described an overwhelming primal dread, a sense of a monstrous, unseen thing following their every move. They spoke of a crushing pressure on the chest, of the feeling of being watched from every corner by something that hated them, and of a cold that was not of temperature, but of the soul. The entity of 50 Berkeley Square was a predator of sanity, and its hunting ground was the human psyche. For Alex, whose entire journey was predicated on observing and documenting, the prospect of an intelligence that targeted the very faculty of observation was a uniquely terrifying challenge. Securing access required a different kind of negotiation, one that involved assurances of discretion and a signed waiver that felt more like a will. The current owners, who never stayed in the house themselves, spoke of strange noises, of objects misplaced, and of a pervasive, unshakable feeling of not being alone that made the beautiful rooms utterly unlivable. Holding the heavy, old-fashioned key, Alex stood on the pristine doorstep, the hum of London traffic a distant, mundane world away. The air in the square was still. Taking a deep breath, they inserted the key into the lock. The click echoed with a grim finality. Stepping across the threshold was like diving into deep, icy water. The elegant foyer was immaculate, with a polished marble floor and a delicate chandelier, but the atmosphere was thick, heavy, and stale. It was the silence that struck first. A dead, muffled silence that seemed to absorb sound, making the soft click of the door closing behind them seem deafening. The air was cold, but it was a dry, static cold, unlike the damp chills of the countryside castles. Alex set down their equipment bag, the routine action feeling absurdly normal. In the abnormal stillness, then, the feeling began. It started as a prickle on the back of the neck, the common sensation of being watched, but within seconds it intensified, evolving into a concrete, oppressive certainty. It was not the feeling of a single pair of eyes, but of a multitude, a sentient awareness that filled the space, pressing in from the walls, the ceiling, the very air. Alex turned slowly, their heart beginning to hammer a frantic rhythm against their ribs. The foyer was empty. The grand staircase leading upward was empty. The doorways to the drawing room and study revealed only tastefully arranged furniture. Yet, the feeling of being followed, of being stalked by an unseen presence, was so overpowering it was almost a physical force. It was a predatory attention, intelligent and focused, and it was fixated entirely on them. The elegant townhouse was not empty. It was occupied by a terror that had no face, no name, and no mercy, and it had already marked its new visitor. The elegant foyer of 50 Berkeley Square had become a cage, its polished surfaces and tasteful decor a cruel mockery of the primal fear coiling in the air. The feeling of being stalked did not lessen, it intensified, a constant, grinding pressure against Alex's sanity. The plan had been a night vigil, a controlled observation from the first-floor drawing room, but the entity seemed to have other plans. It was not content to be observed. It wanted to interact. Setting up the equipment felt like a futile act of defiance, a child building a sandcastle against an incoming tide. The digital recorder's red light glowed, a tiny beacon in the oppressive gloom, while the EMF meter remained deceptively calm, its silence more unnerving than any spike. The terror here was not electromagnetic, it was psychological, a poison seeping directly into the mind. As midnight approached, the house shifted from a state of watchful silence to one of active menace. The first sound was a faint, dry scratching, like a bundle of twigs being dragged slowly across the floorboards of the room directly above. It was a small, insignificant noise, yet it set Alex's teeth on edge. It was the sound of something that should not be moving, of something without flesh or bone attempting to locomote. The scratching paused, then resumed, this time from the wall behind the sofa, as if whatever was causing it was now moving through the solid lath and plaster. A cold sweat broke out on Alex's brow. The rational mind, that battered and bruised defender, scrambled for an explanation. Rats, settling pipes, the wind, but the oppressive, intelligent malevolence in the air made a mockery of such simple answers. Then the voices began. They were not whispers like those at Borley, nor the clear footsteps of Raynham Hall. These were distorted, guttural sounds, layered over one another in a chaotic cacophony. They seemed to emanate from the very air in the center of the room, a knot of auditory static that resolved, for fleeting seconds, into half-formed words. "Get out," one seemed to snarl. "Alone," another moaned, the tone dripping with a venomous glee. "See you," a third hissed, the words slithering through the darkness. They were not the voices of lost souls seeking comfort. They were the taunts of a predator, an intelligence that fed on fear and reveled in the fragility of the human psyche. A crushing weight settled on Alex's chest, a sensation of such profound dread that it became difficult to draw breath. Their heart began to race, a frantic, runaway drumbeat that pounded in their ears, drowning out the phantom voices. The edges of their vision started to darken, speckles of black dancing in the dim light. This was no longer just fear, it was a full-blown panic attack, triggered by the relentless psychological assault. The room seemed to tilt, the elegant furniture warping into monstrous shapes in the periphery. The feeling of being watched was now a physical touch, a cold, invisible hand pressing down on their shoulder, holding them in place. They were trapped, not by locks or bars, but by an unseen terror that was systematically dismantling their composure, brick by mental brick. Gasping for air, Alex slumped forward, head in their hands, the equipment forgotten. In that moment of utter vulnerability, it was the small personal details that made the horror inescapable. A shadow in the corner of the room, cast by nothing, seemed to swell and contract with a slow rhythmic pulse, like a breathing void. The faint pattern on the wallpaper beside them appeared to shift, the delicate floral designs twisting for a moment into screaming faces before snapping back to normal. These were not grand phenomena for the cameras. They were intimate violations, subtle manipulations of perception designed to show that the entity was not just in the house, but in their head. It was making the haunting personal, tailoring its terror to the individual witnessing it, proving that its greatest power was not to show itself, but to show you the depths of your own fear. When the panic finally began to recede, leaving Alex shaking and drained on the floor, the house fell silent once more. The scratching had stopped, the voices were gone. The oppressive weight had lifted, leaving behind only a hollow, trembling exhaustion. The vigil was over. Packing the unused equipment with numb fingers, Alex understood the true, unseen terror of 50 Berkeley Square. It was not a ghost one could photograph or record. It was a mirror, a force that reflected your deepest fears back at you, amplified and weaponized. It taught a harrowing lesson about the power of fear itself, that the most potent hauntings are not those we see with our eyes, but those we feel in the terrified hammering of our own hearts. Some houses hold their ghosts in plain sight, spectres that walk the halls and descend the staircases for any with the eyes to see. But Glamis Castle kept its deepest horror a secret, a truth so terrible it was bricked up, silenced and buried within the very bones of the stone and timbered fortress. It was not a ghost that Alex had come to find, but an absence, a room that officially did not exist, a space whose location was a mystery and whose contents were the subject of fevered, whispered legend. After the formless psychological assault of Berkeley Square, the idea of a tangible, physical secret felt almost like a relief, a mystery that could, in theory, be solved. But Glamis, with its turrets piercing the Scottish sky and its history woven through with Macbeth and royal intrigue, was a place where secrets had a life of their own. The legend of the secret room was the dark heart of Glamis, a story passed down through generations of the Lion family, the castle's owners, and the staff who served them. Alex learned of it from a retired archivist, a man with a voice like rustling parchment, in a dusty study lined with leather-bound books. He spoke not of a ghost, but of a curse, a monstrous secret born in the 15th century. The story varied in the details. A deformed heir kept hidden from the world, a devil-worshipping lord, a card game with Satan that ended in a soul being lost. But the core was always the same. A member of the family was so horrifying, so blasphemous or malformed, that they were sealed away for eternity in a windowless room, and the location of that room was itself a curse. The knowledge was said to pass only to the eldest son upon his coming of age, a burden that reportedly left each heir a changed, grim-faced man. The archivist's tales were not just of a hidden chamber, but of the phenomena that swirled around its unknown location. He spoke of the Grey Lady, a benign spirit often seen in the chapel, believed to be the ghost of Janet Douglas, who was burned as a witch. But he also told of other, less peaceful entities. A tall, silent figure seen standing by bedsides, a phantom page boy who ran errands through the corridors, and the most chilling, the sound of something large and heavy being dragged, thumping slowly and relentlessly through the walls of the oldest part of the castle. These were not the echoes of sorrow Alex had grown accustomed to. They were the symptoms of a hidden sickness, the psychic leakage from a festering wound in the castle's history. To understand the present, Alex knew they had to listen to those who lived within the castle's shadow. They interviewed members of the current staff, from the housekeeper who had served the family for 40 years to a young gardener who had only been there a season. The stories were consistent, delivered with a matter-of-factness that was more convincing than any dramatic retelling. The housekeeper, a woman with calm, capable hands, spoke of closing up the castle at night and hearing the distinct sound of footsteps following her, pacing just behind, only to turn and find the long, tapestry-hung corridor completely empty. She mentioned certain rooms, like the crypt, a windowless dungeon where the air would suddenly grow so thick and cold it was difficult to breathe. The young gardener had a different story. He was tasked with maintaining the hedges below the oldest wing, and he spoke of hearing a low, guttural humming, a tuneless, discordant sound that seemed to emanate from the stone walls themselves on still afternoons. He'd also seen things from the corner of his eye, a pale, sad face at a barred window that should have been part of a sealed-off corridor, a fleeting shadow that moved against the sun on the lawn. None of these accounts pointed to a single defined ghost. Instead, they painted a picture of a building that was actively, restlessly haunted by the secret it was forced to keep. The phenomena were the castle's tells, the subtle signs of a truth struggling to break free. Guided by these stories, Alex began an initial exploration of the castle's sprawling layout. The staterooms were grand and opulent, filled with priceless art and furniture, but it was in the older, less frequented corridors that the atmosphere changed, moving from the bright, airy drawing room into a narrow, stone-flagged passageway leading toward the oldest tower. Alex was struck by a sudden, penetrating chill. It was not the dry, static cold of Berkeley Square, nor the damp misery of Chillingham's dungeon. This was a different kind of cold, sharp, ancient, and intelligent. It seemed to cling to specific stretches of the corridor, coiling around ankles and whispering of things long forgotten. Walking through one of these pockets felt like passing through a veil, a subtle shift in reality that raised the hairs on Alex's arms. There were no apparitions, no dragging chains or phantom footsteps. There was only the cold and a profound, unnerving sense of the unknown lurking just beyond the reach of perception, a hidden truth waiting in the silence behind the walls. The cold was a guide, a phantom thread leading Alex deeper into the labyrinth of Glamis Castle. It was no longer a passive atmospheric condition, but an active, intelligent force, coiling around them in the narrow, stone-flagged corridors of the oldest wing. The grand, opulent staterooms felt a world away, replaced by the oppressive weight of centuries and the whispered legend of the bricked-up room. Armed with a floor plan that was notably incomplete, marked with the vague notation walled off in several locations, and a determination forged in the crucibles of fear and grief, Alex began the methodical, almost sacred task of searching for the impossible. The investigation became a physical dialogue with the castle itself. Alex would press an ear against the cold, damp stone, listening for the hollow resonance that might betray a hidden space, or run a hand along the intricate wood paneling, searching for the nearly imperceptible seam of a concealed door. The air grew heavier with each passing minute, thick with the scent of old dust and dry rot. The castle seemed to resent the intrusion. As Alex approached a particularly ancient-looking section of wall, deep in a corridor that led toward the clock tower, a heavy oak door halfway down the passage suddenly slammed shut with a thunderous, explosive crash that echoed like a gunshot through the silence. The force was violent, unnatural, shaking the very stones underfoot. When Alex rushed to it, the iron latch was cold and immovable, as if it had been sealed for 100 years. It was a warning, a definitive statement from the house. Some doors are not meant to be opened. Undeterred, but with a heart hammering against their ribs, Alex pressed on. The whispers began soon after, rising from the silence like vapors from a swamp. They were not the clear, taunting voices of Berkeley Square, nor the sorrowful murmurs of Borley. These were older, more guttural sounds, a susurrus of forgotten language and choked breaths that seemed to emanate from the mortar between the stones. They coiled around Alex, a cacophony of secrets, sometimes sounding like an argument in a distant room, other times like a single, desperate plea for help that was swallowed by the thick walls. The digital recorder, held out with a trembling hand, captured the unnerving audio, a tapestry of spectral noise that defied any rational explanation. The castle was not just haunted, it was talking, its stones muttering the history they had been forced to contain. In a small, circular antechamber, a place the floor plan indicated was a dead end, Alex felt a moment of profound despair. The wall here was solid, unyielding stone, offering no hint of a hidden passage. The whispers had grown to a fever pitch, the cold was biting, and the sense of a malevolent, watchful presence was overwhelming. Leaning against the cold wall in defeat, a sudden crystalline clarity pierced through the fear and frustration. This was not merely a hunt for a hidden architectural feature. The haunting of Glamis was not about a ghost in a room. It was about the room itself. The slamming doors were not just phenomena, they were metaphors for truths being violently shut away. The whispers were the voice of a buried past, a history too terrible to be acknowledged, struggling to be heard. The secret room was a symbol. It represented every shameful, painful truth that families and institutions hide away, bricking them up in the hope that they will be forgotten. But such truths do not vanish, they fester. They leak their poison into the foundations, manifesting as cold spots, as whispers in the dark, as a pervasive sense of dread. The deformed heir, the devil worshipper, the lost soul. The specifics of the legend were almost irrelevant. The power of the story lay in its universal theme, the terrible cost of secrets. Alex's own quest was a search for a hidden truth about the nature of death and the possibility of an afterlife. In that moment, standing in the heart of Glamis's silent, screaming secret, the personal and the historical merged. The castle's haunting was a grand, Gothic mirror of their own internal struggle, the desperate need to uncover what had been buried, and the terrifying realization that some truths, once uncovered, can never be unseen. The search for the secret room was over, not because they had found it, but because they had finally understood what it meant. The ivy-clad ruins of Bury Pomeroy Castle rose from the dense Devonshire woods like the broken bones of a forgotten giant, their sandstone walls stained dark by rain and centuries of neglect. For Alex, the transition from the oppressive secret-keeping stones of Glamis to this open, skeletal structure felt like moving from a locked room to a windswept moor. Here, the haunting was not hidden. It was a legend worn as openly as the lichen on the crumbling battlements. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and wild garlic, and the only sounds were the cawing of crows and the rustle of leaves in the canopy high above. This was the domain of the White Lady, a spectre whose story was not one of sorrowful pining, but of active, malevolent lure. The castle's caretaker, a man with a face as weathered as the stone he tended, shared the tale with a grim economy of words. The White Lady was said to be the ghost of Margaret Pomeroy, a beautiful young woman of the 15th century, imprisoned in the dungeon by her jealous sister Eleanor. Left to starve in the darkness, Margaret's spirit had never left. But hers was not a passive presence. The caretaker's voice dropped, his eyes scanning the broken walls as if the subject might summon her. She was a banshee, a beautiful, pale apparition in a white gown, who was often seen in the tower windows beckoning to men with a slow, graceful wave of her hand. Those foolish enough to follow her, he claimed, were never seen again, their fates swallowed by the castle's depths or the surrounding woods. She did not mourn, she ensnared. Her beauty was a trap, her silence a promise of doom. This story of active malice was a stark contrast to the passive sorrows Alex had previously encountered. The White Lady was not a relic of tragedy, but an ongoing predator, a siren of stone and shadow. As Alex moved through the roofless great hall, the sun casting long skeletal shadows through empty window frames, the history felt different. It was not a weight of accumulated grief, but a sharp, focused danger. The crumbling state of the castle added to the unease. There were no locked doors here, only gaping openings and treacherous, unstable floors, a physical manifestation of the peril the ghost represented. Navigating through the ruins, Alex climbed a narrow, winding staircase within the still intact gatehouse. The steps were worn smooth by time, and the air grew cooler with each ascent. Reaching a small, circular chamber at the top, they looked out through a lancet window over the verdant canopy of the woods below. The view was breathtaking, a sweeping panorama of untamed nature. It was in that moment of contemplation that a sudden, inexplicable wind rushed through the open chamber. It was not a natural breeze. It was a focused, ice-cold gust that tore through the room, carrying with it the faint, sweet scent of decayed flowers. It whipped around Alex, chilling them to the bone and stirring up centuries of dust into a swirling cloud. Shivering, Alex's gaze was drawn downward, across the courtyard to the base of the ruined keep. There, standing perfectly still in the deep shadow of a crumbling archway, was a figure. It was pale and indistinct, a smudge of white against the dark stone. It was too far away to make out any features, but the form was undeniably that of a woman in a long flowing gown. She did not move, did not beckon, but simply stood, a silent sentinel in the gloom. A jolt, equal parts fear and exhilaration, shot through Alex. This was not a peripheral shadow or a trick of the light. It was a solid, albeit distant, apparition. The White Lady was not just a story told by a caretaker. She was here, and her silent, watchful presence across the sun-dappled courtyard sparked not a desire to flee, but a burning, dangerous curiosity to draw closer, to see the face of the legend that lured people to their doom. The descent from the gatehouse tower was a blur. Alex's focus narrowed to the dark archway where the pale figure had stood. The rational part of their mind screamed a warning, echoing the caretaker's grim tales of those who followed and vanished. But a deeper, more compelling force pulled them forward. The investigators' need for proof, and the grieving soul's desperate hunger for contact. The sunny courtyard seemed to darken as they approached the keep, the air growing still and heavy, the cheerful birdsong from the woods fading into an unnerving silence. The archway was an open mouth of shadow, and Alex stepped into its cool, damp embrace, leaving the world of the living behind. The interior of the keep was a cavern of crumbling stone, open to the sky in places, with a staircase leading down into the true heart of the castle's darkness, the dungeon. The transition was immediate and profound. The light from above barely penetrated the gloom, and the temperature plummeted, the cold here wet and clinging, seeping through clothing to settle in the marrow of the bones. This was where Margaret Pomeroy had been left to die, and her despair had steeped into the very rock. Alex switched on their flashlight, the beam cutting a frail path through the oppressive dark, illuminating rough-hewn walls glistening with moisture. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, rot, and something else, a faint coppery tang, like old blood. Setting up the recorder on a stable-looking outcrop, Alex's hands were unsteady. The silence in the dungeon was not empty, it was a listening silence, a held breath. Then the first sound broke it, a soft, choked sob that seemed to come from the corner where the shadows were deepest. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated misery, a woman's grief given voice across the centuries. It was followed by another, and then a third, escalating into a low, continuous weeping that echoed off the damp stones, a heartbreaking symphony of despair. The digital recorder's light glowed steadily, capturing the spectral cries, each one a nail in the coffin of Alex's remaining skepticism. This was not an environmental noise. It was the sound of a soul in torment. As the weeping swirled around them, a new sensation began, one that made Alex's skin crawl. It started as a faint pressure on their upper arm, a gentle, almost curious touch through the fabric of their jacket. Then, a cold spot bloomed on their back, between their shoulder blades, as if an icy hand had been placed there. The touch was not violent or aggressive, but it was undeniably present, a physical manifestation of the unseen. A wave of dizziness washed over Alex, a disorienting lurch that had nothing to do with the stale air. It was as if the dungeon itself was tilting, the weight of its history and the proximity of death becoming a tangible, vertiginous force. Their own mortality, usually a distant, abstract concept, suddenly felt terrifyingly close and fragile, a thin sheet of ice over an abyss. Leaning against the cold, damp wall for support, Alex was overwhelmed by a profound sense of vulnerability. The professional facade, already cracked by previous hauntings, shattered completely here, in the darkness where Margaret Pomeroy had drawn her last breath. This was no longer about documenting phenomena for a project. It was a raw, personal confrontation with the fact of death itself. The cold touch on their back felt like a greeting from the other side, a reminder that the line between the living and the dead was perilously thin, and that they too would one day cross it. The grief for their lost sister, the engine of this entire quest, rose up and merged with the phantom weeping in the dungeon, becoming one universal cry of loss. In that moment, Alex was not an investigator in a haunted dungeon. They were simply a mortal being, alone in the dark, feeling the chill of the grave and understanding, with terrifying clarity, that some encounters leave a mark, not on a recording device, but on the soul. The experience was unforgettable, not because of the eerie cries or the ghostly touch, but because of the stark, personal vulnerability it exposed, the human fear of the dark, and the silence that waits for everyone. There are places where the haunting is not a relic of a single tragic event, but a slow, seeping stain from a history steeped in everyday violence. The ancient Ram Inn was such a place, a crooked, half-timbered building that slumped into the Gloucestershire earth, as if ashamed of its own past. It was not a castle or a hall, but a pub, a place of communal life that had curdled into something dark and festering. For Alex, the journey to this, the 9th house on their list, felt like a descent into a different stratum of the supernatural, one not of aristocratic sorrow or tortured prisoners, but of rough, ale-soaked malevolence and a ghost who refused to vacate his premises. The inn's reputation preceded it, a cacophony of modern ghost stories whispered on paranormal forums and in hushed tones by locals. Its history was a brutal ledger, a 12th century building erected on an ancient pagan burial ground, later a den for thieves and cutthroats, and the home of its most persistent ghost, a former innkeeper known for his violent temper. The stories told of him were not of mournful pacing, but of active, territorial fury. Guests reported their beds shaking violently in the dead of night, as if gripped by invisible, furious hands. Others spoke of a guttural, angry voice growling obscenities in their ears, commanding them to leave. The haunting was not a passive echo, it was an eviction notice from beyond the grave. Pulling up to the inn, Alex felt an immediate sense of foreboding. The building was a patchwork of sagging beams and mismatched stone, its windows like suspicious, half-closed eyes. Weeds choked the small garden, and a twisted ancient wisteria clawed its way up the wall, looking less like a plant and more like a petrified serpent. The air was still and heavy, carrying the damp fungal scent of rotting wood. Before even stepping inside, Alex sought out the current caretaker, a weary-looking man who seemed to carry the weight of the inn's history in the slump of his shoulders. He confirmed the tales with a grim resignation, speaking of objects that would fly from shelves, of doors that locked themselves from the inside, and of the pervasive, suffocating feeling of being watched by someone or something that despised all visitors. Steeling themselves, Alex finally pushed open the heavy, low-set door and stepped into the inn's main room. The interior was a time capsule of oppressive antiquity. The ceiling was oppressively low, the massive blackened beams seeming to press down upon the space. The floor slanted at a disorienting angle, and the air was thick with the smell of old smoke, spilled ale and dust. It was dim, the small leaded windows allowing only slivers of the afternoon light to penetrate the gloom. The atmosphere was not one of sorrow, as in Borley, or of terror, as in Berkeley Square, but of a deep-seated, simmering anger. It felt like walking into an argument that had been paused for centuries, the hostility still vibrating in the very air. Alex set their equipment bag down on a rough-hewn wooden table, the sound unnaturally loud in the watchful silence. The plan was to conduct a preliminary sweep, to get a feel for the layout and the energy of the place before the planned overnight vigil. Moving toward the stone hearth, cold and filled with ancient ash, Alex's eye was caught by a small pewter tankard sitting on the mantelpiece. It was dusty and tarnished, a simple relic of the inn's past life. As they watched, the tankard, without any discernible cause, shuddered. Then, with a slow, deliberate scrape of metal on stone, it slid several inches along the mantel before coming to a stop. There was no vibration from the floor, no open window causing a draft. The movement was isolated, purposeful. A moment later, from a shadowy corner of the room, a heavy leather-bound book tumbled from a high shelf, hitting the slanted floor with a dull, definitive thud. The pages fluttered open, as if in invitation or accusation. The objects in the ancient Ram Inn were not inanimate. They were watchful and they were moving, making it abundantly clear that the innkeeper was still very much on duty, and he did not appreciate the intrusion. Sleep was a foreign country Alex could not reach. The bed in the inn's most infamous room was a hard, lumpy raft, adrift on a sea of oppressive silence. The darkness was not merely an absence of light, but a tangible substance, thick and heavy with the residue of centuries of violence and despair. Every creak of the ancient timbers, every rustle of the wind outside, was magnified into a potential threat. The air itself tasted of dust and decay, a constant reminder that they were breathing the same atmosphere as the inn's long-dead, malevolent residents. Alex lay rigid, the flashlight clutched like a talisman, their senses stretched to a razor's edge, waiting. The innkeeper's ghost was not a story anymore, it was a promise of confrontation hanging in the stale air. Then, a familiar and terrifying rigidity began to seep into Alex's limbs. It started in the toes, a cold, leaden sensation that crawled up their calves and thighs, locking the muscles in place. A crushing weight settled on their chest, making each breath a shallow, desperate gasp. Their minds screamed for movement, for a single twitch of a finger, but their body was a prison of flesh and bone, utterly unresponsive. Sleep paralysis. The rational part of their brain identified the phenomenon, a well-documented glitch of the nervous system. But in the heart of the ancient Ram Inn, rationality held no power. This was not a medical event, it was a supernatural ambush. They were pinned, helpless, a specimen under the gaze of an unseen predator. Through the suffocating veil of paralysis, a patch of darkness at the foot of the bed began to coalesce. It was not a trick of the light-adjusting eyes, it was a positive presence, a void that drew the scant illumination from the room and consumed it. The shadow thickened, rising from the floorboards like black smoke, until it resolved into the solid, humanoid shape of a man. It was tall and broad-shouldered, a silhouette of pure menace. It had no discernible features, no face or clothing, yet its posture radiated a palpable, seething anger. This was the innkeeper. He stood motionless, a sentinel of hatred at the foot of the bed, his unseen gaze fixed upon the paralyzed form of his unwanted guest. Time lost all meaning. The entity did not move, did not speak, but its presence was an active assault. A wave of pure, undiluted malice poured from the shadowy figure, a psychic venom that seeped into Alex's mind. It was a feeling of being utterly despised, of being an intruder in a domain where they were not just unwelcome, but loathed. The crushing weight on their chest intensified, the struggle for each breath becoming a battle for survival. This was not the sorrowful observation of the nun or the chilling tableau of the brown lady. This was an intimate violation, a direct personal communication of hatred from beyond the grave. The innkeeper was not merely present, he was making his feelings known in the most visceral way possible. Just as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure released. The leaden weight vanished from Alex's limbs, and they gasped, sucking in a great, ragged lungful of the foul air. They scrambled upright, fumbling for the flashlight, its beam slicing through the darkness and landing on the foot of the bed. The space was empty. The shadowy figure was gone. But the feeling of its presence, the residue of its malevolence, clung to the room like a toxic perfume. Alex sat trembling, heart hammering against their ribs, the reality of the encounter burning in their mind. The line between a waking nightmare and a supernatural event had been erased. The experience was too vivid, too charged with intelligent hostility to be dismissed as a simple sleep disorder. In the profound silence that followed, Alex was left with a single chilling certainty that shook the foundations of their worldview. They were no longer questioning if ghosts were real, but grappling with the terrifying knowledge that some of them were capable of a hatred that death itself could not extinguish. The sound of weeping is a universal language of sorrow, a raw human expression of a heart breaking. It was this sound, more than any apparition or poltergeist, that Alex sought at Bodelwyddan Castle. After the intimate malevolence of the ancient Ram Inn, the prospect of a haunting rooted in pure, unadulterated grief felt almost like a cleansing. The castle, a grand Victorian-era manor of pale sandstone set amidst manicured Welsh gardens, presented a facade of orderly elegance, a stark contrast to the crooked, angry timbers of the inn. But Alex had learned that the most beautiful facades often hid the deepest pains, and Bodelwyddan's beauty was a mask for a tragedy of love and loss that had never released its hold on the place. The legend of the weeping woman was not one of violence or spectral revenge, but of a love story cut short. Research in the local library and conversations with historians pieced together the tale of a young woman, a lady of the house in the mid-19th century, who had fallen deeply in love with a stable hand. Their secret affair was discovered, and the young man was immediately dismissed and sent away. The lady, whose name had been lost to time but whose sorrow had not, was forced into a marriage of convenience with a man of her family's station. It was said she spent the rest of her life wandering the castle's corridors and the surrounding woodlands, pining for her lost love, her endless tears soaking into the very fabric of her home, until her death from a broken heart. Her spirit, the story went, remained, forever weeping for the life she was denied. This narrative of romantic tragedy resonated with a particular frequency for Alex. It was not the brutal agony of Chillingham or the predatory terror of Berkeley Square. It was a quiet, personal devastation, a story of a future stolen. It mirrored the core of their own grief, not for a romantic love, but for a future with a sister that had been abruptly and irrevocably cancelled. The weeping woman was not a monster. She was a mirror, and Alex felt a pull toward her story that was more empathetic than investigative. Upon arriving at the castle, the atmosphere was deceptively peaceful. Sunlight streamed through. Tall windows, illuminating grand rooms filled with opulent furniture and portraits of stern-faced ancestors. The air was scented with beeswax and the faint sweet perfume from the lavish floral arrangements. Yet, as Alex moved away from the main thoroughfares and into the older west wing of the castle, the energy began to shift. The grandeur gave way to quieter, more somber corridors lined with darker wood and heavier drapes. The air grew still, the cheerful sounds of visiting tourists fading into a muffled distance. It was here, in a long gallery hung with landscapes of misty Welsh valleys, that Alex first heard it. A soft, muffled sob, so faint it was almost a vibration in the air rather than a sound. It seemed to come from behind a large tapestry depicting a medieval hunt, its threads faded with age. Alex stood perfectly still, holding their breath, the recorder in their hand whirring silently. The sob came again, a little clearer this time. A woman's voice choked with a sorrow so profound it felt ancient. It was not a frightening sound, it was a heartbreaking one. A wave of deep, resonant sadness seemed to emanate from the very walls, a palpable emotion that hung in the air like a fine mist. It was not the oppressive despair of a dungeon or the seething anger of an inn. This was a cleaner, purer form of grief, one that spoke of love remembered rather than horrors endured. This emotional resonance evoked a powerful, unexpected empathy in Alex. Their own loss, usually a sharp, private pain, rose to the surface and mingled with the spectral sorrow filling the gallery. They were not just a documentarian recording a phenomenon, they were a fellow mourner in the presence of another's eternal heartbreak. The quest for proof felt secondary to the simple human act of witnessing this grief, of acknowledging that this pain, however old, was still real. The weeping woman was not a ghost to be captured on film, but a sorrow to be felt, and in the quiet of the gallery, surrounded by the soft, spectral sobs, Alex felt it completely. The soft sobs were a siren's call, leading Alex deeper into the castle's quiet heart, away from the sunlit galleries and into a warren of lesser-used rooms. The air grew heavier, the opulent sense of polish and flowers replaced by the faint, dusty aroma of forgotten spaces and dried tears. Guided by the intermittent, heartbreaking sound, Alex found themselves at the end of a narrow corridor, facing a simple, unadorned door of dark oak. It was a servant's room, or perhaps a lady's private sitting room, a space untouched by the grand renovations that had brightened the rest of the castle. The weeping was clearest here, emanating from behind the wood, as if the very timbers were mourning. Taking a steadying breath, Alex turned the cold brass handle and pushed the door open. The room within was small and sparsely furnished, lit only by the grey afternoon light filtering through a single leaded window that overlooked a secluded corner of the garden. A simple wooden chair sat in the centre of the room, and a worn tapestry depicting a lone weeping willow hung on the far wall. But it was the space near the window that commanded attention. The air there shimmered, not with heat, but with a coalescing cold. A faint, luminescent haze began to form, swirling like mist on a riverbank, gradually pulling itself into a recognizable shape. It was the figure of a woman, translucent and glowing with a soft internal light. She was dressed in the high-collared, flowing gown of the Victorian era, her head bowed, her face hidden by a fall of spectral hair. Her shoulders shook with the force of her silent, eternal weeping. Alex stood frozen in the doorway, the breath catching in their throat. This was no shadow, no trick of the light. It was an apparition, a manifest soul, and the sorrow pouring from it was a physical weight in the room. With trembling hands, Alex raised the laser thermometer. The digital display, a stark, rational number in the heart of the irrational, confirmed the impossible. The ambient temperature in the corridor had been a cool 15 degrees Celsius. Here, in the center of the room, it was 12. But as Alex pointed the device at the shimmering form by the window, the numbers plummeted. 7 degrees, 5. The cold was radiating from the apparition itself, a deep soul chill that had nothing to do with drafts or stone walls. It was the cold of the grave, of a love frozen in time, of a heart that had stopped beating long ago, but had never ceased to break. Alex documented the drop, the scientist in them mechanically logging the data, but the human being was utterly captivated, lost in the raw, visible truth of the ghost's despair. As they watched, the apparition slowly raised its head. There were no hollow eyes like the brown lady's, no features twisted in malice. The face was pale and beautiful, etched with an expression of such profound, bottomless loss that it struck Alex like a physical blow. For a long, suspended moment, the weeping woman seemed to look directly at them, her gaze not one of anger or invitation, but of shared understanding. It was a look that bypassed the centuries, a communion of grief between two souls who knew the shape of absence. In that silent exchange, the haunting was no longer a subject to be studied. The spectral woman by the window and the living investigator in the doorway were united by the same universal human experience, the agonizing pain of losing someone you love. Then, as softly as she had appeared, the apparition began to fade, the luminous outline blurred, the details of her gown and face dissolving back into the faint, swirling mist. The temperature in the room began to slowly climb, the biting cold retreating as the form dissipated. Within seconds, only the empty chair and the grey light from the window remained. The weeping had stopped. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was different now. It was not empty, but respectful, hallowed by the visitation that had just occurred. Alex slowly lowered their equipment, the readings and recordings suddenly feeling insignificant. Standing alone in the quiet room, they were overcome by a moment of deep, personal reflection. The weeping woman was not a random ghost. She was a symbol. Her eternal vigil was not for a stable hand, but for all lost loves, for all futures stolen by time and circumstance. Her haunting was a testament to the fact that some grief is so powerful, so integral to a person's soul, that not even death can silence it. Alex's own journey, their search for a sister in the silence, was a mirror of this ghost's endless sorrow. They had not found proof of an afterlife for the world, but in the weeping woman's transparent, grieving form, they had found a reflection of their own heart. The haunting was not just about her loss, it was about all loss, And in that understanding, Alex found not a fear of death, but a heartbreaking, beautiful connection to the enduring power of love. Some hauntings are not born of tragedy or terror, but of art, an obsession so powerful it outlives the artist, echoing through the halls long after the final curtain has fallen. For Alex, the journey to Craigienos Castle in the Welsh Brecon Beacons felt like a transition from the visceral horrors of the body to the more elusive phantoms of the soul. The castle, a grand Italianate structure built by the legendary opera diva Adelina Patti, was not a place of dungeons or weeping women, but a temple to a single magnificent voice. Its legend was not one of a ghost seeking vengeance or solace, but of a spirit forever rehearsing, forever performing, unable to relinquish the stage even in death. After the raw, emotional communion with the weeping woman, the idea of a haunting woven from music and memory felt both ethereal and profoundly poignant. The approach to Craigienos was like stepping into a forgotten fairy tale. The castle rose from the lush river valley, its ornate towers and balconies a stark, romantic contrast to the wild green hills surrounding it. Adelina Patti had not just lived here, she had built her own private kingdom, complete with its own opera house within the grounds, a lavish 150-seat theatre where she performed for invited guests. The air was clean and crisp, scented with pine and damp earth, a world away from the stale miasma of the ancient Ram Inn or the metallic tang of Chillingham's dungeon. But as Alex walked the manicured paths, a different kind of energy began to make itself known, not one of sorrow or anger, but of a fierce, possessive love for the beauty that had been created here. The castle's archivist, a woman with the patient demeanor of a librarian and the gleam of a true believer in her eyes, was the keeper of Patti's flame. She spoke not of a ghost, but of a presence. Adelina Patti, she explained, had loved Craigienos with a passion that bordered on mania. It was her sanctuary, her stage, her entire world. When she died in 1919, she had left the estate with a stipulation that it be preserved exactly as it was. Her spirit, the archivist claimed, had honored that wish in her own way, never truly leaving. The tales were not of apparitions, but of phantom performances. Staff and visitors alike reported hearing the clear, soaring notes of an aria, usually from the empty theatre, the voice unmistakably that of a trained soprano. Others spoke of the sound of a piano playing in the dead of night, of shadowy figures seen in the private boxes, and of the overwhelming feeling of being a privileged audience member at a show for one. The archivist saved her most compelling evidence for last. She led Alex to a small, soundproofed room and played a series of digital audio files. These were recordings made by previous paranormal investigators during overnight vigils. The first few were filled with the usual static and ambiguous bumps. Then a new track began. Through the hiss of silence, a melody emerged, a few clear, perfectly pitched notes of an old Italian aria, unaccompanied and heartbreakingly beautiful. It lasted only a few seconds before fading away. Another recording captured the faint rhythmic tapping of a conductor's baton, followed by the shimmering, ethereal chord of a ghostly orchestra tuning its instruments. There was no logical source for these sounds. They were not radio interference or environmental noise. They were music, plucked from the past and imprinted upon the present. Alex listened, captivated, the skeptic in them silenced by the sheer, impossible artistry of the phenomena. Guided by these recordings, Alex made their way to the heart of the castle's haunting, the private theatre. Stepping inside was like entering a jewel box frozen in time. Plush red velvet seats faced a grand, gilded proscenium arch. The stage curtains, heavy with gold thread, were drawn, and the air was thick with the scent of old velvet and dust. It was magnificent, and it was utterly still. Yet, as Alex walked down the center aisle, a profound shift occurred. The silence was no longer empty, it was anticipatory. It was the silence of a held breath before the overture begins, the quiet of 1,000 unseen eyes waiting for the performance to start. Setting up a recorder on a velvet-covered seat, Alex felt it, a presence. It was not the oppressive weight of Berkeley Square or the seething anger of the innkeeper. This was a different kind of awareness, a focused, artistic attention that seemed to emanate from the stage itself. It was the feeling of being scrutinized by a perfectionist, of being assessed by a diva who demanded a worthy audience. A faint cold spot materialized in the center of the aisle, a pocket of air that was 10 degrees cooler than the rest of the theater. As Alex stood within it, a single pure high note seemed to hang in the air for a fraction of a second, a phantom vocalize, there and gone so quickly it could have been. Imagination, but which resonated in the bones long after the sound had faded. The theater was not empty. It was occupied by the ghost of a song, and the prima donna was in her house, waiting for her cue. The single phantom note hung in the theater's air, a shimmering question mark that faded into the velvet-draped silence. It was not an echo, but a presence, a vocal fingerprint left by an unseen singer. The cold spot in the center aisle persisted, a tangible anchor for the ethereal energy that now charged the atmosphere. Alex stood within its chill, every sense heightened, the recorder in their hand whirring like a faithful scribe to this audience of one. The grand stage, with its closed curtains, was no longer just wood and fabric. It was a threshold, and something was preparing to cross. Then, a soft glow began to emanate from behind the heavy curtains, a diffuse pearlescent light that had no earthly source. It grew in intensity, casting long, dancing shadows across the gilded boxes and the empty seats. The air itself seemed to thrum with a silent vibration, the prelude to a performance only Alex could witness. The curtains did not part, but a figure began to materialize in front of them, on the stage itself. It was a woman, her form composed of the same luminous mist as the light behind her. She was tall and graceful, dressed in the opulent gown of a bygone era, its spectral folds shimmering with a light of their own. Her face was turned in profile, her features refined and proud, her head held in the posture of a performer awaiting her cue. This was no sorrowful wraith or angry spirit. This was Adelina Patti, the opera ghost, captured in the moment of her art. As the apparition solidified, the sound began. It started as a hum, a vocal warm-up that resonated deep within Alex's chest. Then it swelled into a full, unaccompanied aria. The voice was breathtaking, clear, powerful, and filled with a technical perfection that could only belong to a master. It soared. Through the octaves, each note perfectly pitched, each phrase imbued with a passion that death had not diminished. The music was not heard with the ears alone, it was felt, a physical force that vibrated in the bones and stirred the soul. It was a piece from an Italian opera, a lament of lost love, and the emotion poured from the stage in an overwhelming torrent of sound and sorrow. The ghost was not merely repeating a song, she was living it, her entire spectral being an instrument for the beauty and heartbreak of the music. A powerful, unexpected wave of emotion crashed over Alex. Tears welled in their eyes, not from fear, but from a profound, aesthetic awe. The line between past and present dissolved completely. The empty theater vanished, replaced by the vision of a glittering, invited audience, the air thick with anticipation and the scent of perfume. Alex was no longer a 21st century investigator. They were a guest at a private recital in the late 1800s, granted a glimpse into the soul of the artist who had built this kingdom of song. The haunting was not a residual echo, but a living performance, a moment of artistic perfection forever trapped in a loop of eternity. The ghost on stage was not trapped by tragedy, but by her own sublime passion, forever bound to the art that had defined her life. The aria reached its crescendo, the singer's luminous form glowing with the effort, her hands raised in a dramatic gesture that seemed to pull the very notes from the air. The final, sustained note hung in the silence, a perfect piercing point of sound that seemed to stretch time itself. Then it was over. The note faded, the light behind the curtains dimmed, and the apparition began to dissolve. The proud profile softened, the shimmering gown blurred into mist, and within seconds the stage was empty once more. The cold spot in the aisle vanished, and the theater's atmosphere returned to its previous state of watchful silence. Alex stood alone in the vast, quiet space, the ghost of the music still ringing in their ears. The emotional response left them trembling, a cocktail of awe, sadness, and a strange, exultant joy. They had not witnessed a haunting of terror or grief, but one of transcendent beauty. The experience blurred the very definition of life and death, suggesting that a spirit could be defined not by its pain, but by its passion. Packing up the equipment with reverent hands, Alex knew that Craigie-Nose had offered a unique gift. It was a reminder that some echoes were not of suffering, but of sublime artistry, and that the most powerful ghosts were sometimes not those who mourned a life lost, but those who celebrated a love that even death could not silence. Some legends are not confined to the crumbling stone of a castle's keep, or the dusty silence of its halls, but ride free upon the wind, a phantom heartbeat echoing across the open grounds. For Alex, the journey to Dunster Castle in Somerset was a departure from the intimate interior hauntings that had come before. This was a haunting of landscape and motion, a spectral event that unfolded under the open sky, its central figure a creature of folklore so potent it had bled from storybooks into the realm of reported fact. The headless horseman of Dunster was not a sorrowful lady or a tortured soul, but a force of nature, a thunderous echo of a violent past that refused to be still. After the transcendent artistry of the opera ghost, the raw, primal energy of this legend felt like a return to the earth itself, to a time when ghosts were not just presences, but powers. The castle, perched on a wooded hill overlooking the medieval village of Dunster, was a picture of Norman solidity and Victorian romance, its stone walls and lush gardens belying the grim tale that rode its perimeter. The story was a classic of English folklore rooted in the turbulent years of the Civil War. A royalist cavalry officer, so the legend went, had been decapitated by a Roundhead. Cannonball, during a skirmish near the castle, denied a proper burial and the peace of the grave. His spirit was condemned to forever ride the ancient track known as the King's Way, searching the moonlit grounds for his lost head. He was not a ghost to be met in a corridor, but a phenomenon to be witnessed, a sudden drop in temperature, the thunder of unseen hooves, and the fleeting, terrifying glimpse of a headless man astride a spectral steed. Alex began their investigation not in the castle's archives, but among the people of the village below, those whose lives were lived in the long shadow of the legend. In a cozy pub with low beamed ceilings and a crackling fire, they found their first witnesses. An elderly farmer, his hands gnarled from a lifetime of work, spoke in a slow Somerset burr. He described hearing the sound on still autumn nights, the distinct, rhythmic clopping of a single horse, moving at a gallop along the track that skirted his land. The sound, he insisted, had no source. It would approach, reach a crescendo right beside his fence line, and then fade into nothingness, leaving behind only a profound, bone-deep chill in the air. He was a practical man, not given to fancy, but his conviction was unshakable. He had heard the horsemen. A young couple, avid walkers who often hiked the hills at dusk, shared their own story. They had been on the King's Way as the last light bled from the sky. The temperature had plummeted so suddenly that their breath plumed in great white clouds, and an unnatural silence had fallen, swallowing the evening birdsong. Then came the hoofbeats, not from the path, but from all around them, a percussive vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. They had felt a rush of air, cold as a winter grave, and an overwhelming sense of being in the presence of something ancient and tragically wrong. They hadn't seen anything, but the feeling, they said, was more than enough. It was a sensory assault, a historical moment, replaying itself with violent intensity. Listening to these accounts, Alex felt a shift in their own perception of the supernatural. This was not a haunting of personal grief, but of historical event, a moment of traumatic death so powerful it had scarred the very landscape. The witnesses did not speak of emotions or messages. They described a physical phenomenon, a recurring echo of a specific violent instant. The horseman was not trying to communicate, he was simply repeating. This sense of history alive, of the past refusing to lie down and be forgotten, lent the legend a terrifying and impersonal power. The ghost was not a person but an event, and to encounter him was to be swept up in the replay of his death, Walking the grounds of Dunster Castle as the afternoon waned, Alex felt the truth of these stories in the air. The formal gardens were tranquil, but the ancient woodland that clung to the slopes and the open expanse of the King's Way held a different energy. The breeze carried not just the scent of pine and damp earth, but a whisper of old iron and cold steel. Standing on the rutted, historic track, Alex could easily imagine the phantom charge, the desperation of a lost cause, and the brutal sudden end that had given birth to a legend. The castle itself, solid and enduring on its hill, seemed to watch over this eternal reenactment, a silent keeper of a story written not in stone, but in sound and cold and the collective memory of the land. The headless horseman was waiting, and Alex, with a mixture of dread and a historian's fervour, prepared to listen for the coming storm. The golden light of the Somerset afternoon bled away, swallowed by a creeping dusk that painted the wooded slopes of Dunster in shades of indigo and grey. The air, once carrying the distant bleating of sheep and the chatter of departing tourists, grew still and heavy, holding its breath for the nightly performance. Alex stood on the ancient rutted path of the King's Way, the very ground where history and legend collided. The stories from the village pub were no longer just tales, they were a script, and the stage was set. The air was cool, but it was a natural evening coolness. That was about to change. It began not with a sound, but with a sensation, a sudden violent drop in temperature that felt like being plunged into an icy river. The change was so abrupt it stole the breath from Alex's lungs. The laser thermometer, clutched in a hand that was already growing numb, confirmed the impossible. The ambient temperature had plummeted nearly 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. This was not the damp chill of a dungeon or the static cold of a townhouse. This was a wild, aggressive cold that carried the bite of a winter gale and the metallic tang of old blood and saddle leather. It was a cold that announced the arrival of something powerful, something that rode on the wind itself. Then the silence shattered. From the deep shadows of the woods lining the track came the sound of horse hooves. They were not the gentle clop of a leisurely ride, but the thunderous, percussive rhythm of a full-blooded gallop. The sound was immense, echoing not just through the air but through the very earth, a vibration that travelled up through the soles of Alex's boots and into their bones. It was the sound of urgency, of panic, of a flight that had no end. The hoofbeats grew rapidly closer, a storm of spectral sound approaching with terrifying speed, yet the path ahead remained utterly empty. There was no horse, no rider, only the deafening evidence of their phantom charge. A wave of primal fear, older than reason, washed over Alex. This was not the intimate dread of a ghost in a room, but the terrifying awe of standing in the path of an elemental force. The sound reached a deafening crescendo, seeming to come from a point just feet away. The vibration so intense it felt as if their own ribs were the drum. The frigid air whipped around them, a localized hurricane of cold and sound. And in the heart of that maelstrom, for a single heart-stopping second, the legend solidified into terrifying reality. There, in the middle of the empty path, a figure coalesced from the swirling cold and shadow. It was a man astride a powerful spectral steed, both rider and horse shimmering with a faint phosphorescent glow. The horse was a massive destrier, its coat the colour of tarnished silver, its eyes burning with a faint, hellish light. It was frozen mid-gallop, a statue of motion and power. But it was the rider that stole all reason and rooted Alex to the spot. He was clad in the tattered remnants of a royalist officer's uniform, one hand gripping the reins, the other holding a ghostly sword. And where his head should have been, there was nothing. Just the empty, ragged collar of his coat, a void that screamed of violent, sudden death. The sight was brief, lasting no more than 2 or 3 seconds, but it was imprinted upon Alex's mind with the permanence of a brand. The headless torso, the proud, desperate posture, the sheer tragic wrongness of the figure. It was an image from a nightmare-given form. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the vision dissolved. The shimmering light winked out, the thunderous hoofbeats ceased their deafening roar, fading with unnatural swiftness into the distance, until only the ringing silence remained. The biting cold retreated, the temperature climbing back to that of a normal autumn evening, leaving Alex shivering not from the chill, but from the aftershock of the encounter. They stood alone on the darkening path, the world slowly returning to normal around them. The legend of the Headless Horseman was no longer a collection of witness statements or a piece of local folklore. It was a confirmed, terrifying reality. The sighting had been brief, but it was unequivocal. In that fleeting, phosphorescent vision, every doubt Alex had ever nurtured about the tangible reality of ghosts was incinerated. The horseman was real. He was a thunderous echo of a violent death, forever riding the border between history and nightmare, and for one paralyzing moment, he had allowed a living soul to witness his endless, headless journey. The experience did not just document a haunting, it solidified the legend into a terrifying personal truth that would ride with Alex long after they had left the shadow of Dunster Castle behind. The haunting of East Riddlesden Hall arrived not as a whisper of sorrow or a shiver of dread, but as a ripple of jovial laughter on the still Yorkshire air. After the thunderous, headless terror of Dunster, the shift in atmosphere was as disorienting as it was welcome. The hall was not a grim fortress, but a sturdy, stone-built manor house nestled in the Aire Valley, its mullioned windows and sweeping gardens suggesting a history of domesticity rather than despair. Here the ghost was not a tortured soul or a vengeful spirit, but a cavalier, a dashing royalist from the English Civil War, forever clad in his finery, whose presence was marked not by cold spots or weeping, but by the sound of merriment and the inexplicable unlocking of doors. For Alex, still rattled by the visceral horror of the horseman, the prospect of a cheerful haunting felt like stepping out of a thunderstorm and into a candle-lit tavern. The story, as told by the hall's elderly volunteer guide, was a refreshing anomaly. The cavalier had no tragic, lovelorn backstory or grisly end. He was simply a man who had loved life, his home, and his parties too much to let a little thing like death get in the way. He was most often seen in the great hall, a handsome figure in doublet and breeches, his feathered hat at a rakish angle, sometimes raising a spectral glass in a silent toast. The phenomena associated with him were uniquely benign, the sound of hearty, masculine laughter echoing from empty rooms, the faint scent of pipe tobacco and wine, and, most peculiarly, locked. Rooms found mysteriously ajar, as if the ghostly host was ensuring his guests could explore every corner of his beloved home. This playful twist on the classic haunting captivated Alex. It challenged the very foundation of their growing understanding of the supernatural. Ghosts were supposed to be sorrowful, angry, or terrifying. They were echoes of trauma. The cavalier, however, seemed to be an echo of joy, a man so in love with his life that he had simply refused to leave it behind. It suggested that a spirit could be defined not by its pain, but by its passions, a notion that resonated deeply after the artistic eternity of the opera ghost. This was not a haunting to be endured, but one to be experienced, perhaps even enjoyed. Stepping into the great hall was like walking into a preserved piece of the 17th century. The air was warm and carried the pleasant dusty scent of old timber and beeswax. A magnificent carved wooden screen dominated one end of the room, and the long oak refectory table gleamed under the soft light. The atmosphere was peaceful, almost cozy. Yet, as Alex moved through the ground floor, a subtle, playful energy began to make itself known. In a small, wood-paneled parlor, a door that the guide had explicitly stated was kept locked. A storage closet for cleaning supplies stood slightly ajar. The heavy iron key was still in the outside lock, untouched. Pushing it open revealed nothing but mops and buckets, yet the act itself felt significant, an invitation from an unseen hand. Further down a narrow corridor, a sound drifted from a room dedicated to an exhibition of 17th century textiles. It was the clear, unmistakable sound of a man's laughter, not a mocking or manic cackle, but a warm, genuine chuckle of amusement. It was there for a moment, rich and full-bodied, seeming to come from the center of the empty room, before fading away as if the joker had just remembered he was supposed to be a ghost. Alex stood still, a smile tugging unexpectedly at their own lips. The sound held no menace, only a contagious, anachronistic cheer. It was a sound out of time, a pocket of merriment preserved like a fly in amber. The cavalier was not merely present, he was in good spirits, and his haunting was a unique, almost whimsical counterpoint to the darkness that had defined so much of Alex's journey. A reminder that not all echoes from the past were screams, some were laughter. The lingering echo of the cavalier's laughter seemed to hang in the air of the textile room, a warm, auditory ghost that painted the dusty silence with hues of merriment and life. Alex stood for a long moment, not in fear, but in a state of bemused curiosity. The encounter was so starkly different from anything that had come before. There was no crushing weight of sorrow, no seeping malevolence, only this playful, almost flirtatious presence that seemed to enjoy the game of hide and seek. Moving back into the corridor, the atmosphere felt lighter, charged with a benign, watchful energy that was more companionable than threatening. The hall itself seemed to breathe a sigh of contentment, a building at peace with its eternal, cheerful tenant. Driven by this newfound curiosity, Alex continued their exploration, drawn toward the older western wing of the manor. The corridor here was narrower, the floorboards more worn, the air cooler and carrying the faint, sweet scent of old wood and dried rose petals. It was a more private, intimate space, away from the public grandeur of the great hall. Halfway down its length, a sudden and distinct drop in temperature occurred, a cold spot that wrapped around Alex like a sudden embrace from a winter stream. But unlike the aggressive, soul-chilling cold of Dunster or the damp misery of Chillingham, this cold was sharp, clean, and fleeting, like stepping through a pocket of air from a long-past winter. It was a signature, a calling card left in the atmosphere, and then he was there, materializing from the confluence of shadow and cold air at the far end of the hallway. The cavalier appeared not as a shimmering mist or a terrifying void, but as a figure of startling solidity. He was tall and well-built, dressed in the flamboyant finery of a 17th-century royalist, a deep crimson doublet slashed with silver, breeches of cream-colored silk, and bucket-top boots. A cloak was draped casually over one shoulder, and a wide-brimmed hat with an ostentatious plume sat upon a full head of dark, curling hair. His face was handsome, clean-shaven, and bore a faint, knowing smile, as if he were privy to a delightful secret. He stood perfectly still, one hand resting on the hilt of his sword, the other held slightly away from his body, as if frozen mid-gesture in a conversation with an unseen companion. A wave of sensation washed over Alex, a complex cocktail of feelings that was entirely new. There was the undeniable, instinctual eeriness of standing in the presence of a being that should not exist, a primal recognition of the supernatural that raised the hairs on their arms. But layered over that was a profound and unexpected sense of friendliness. The spirit radiated no hostility, no sorrow, no desperate need. His energy was one of contentment, of a man perfectly at home in his own eternity. He seemed aware of Alex, his dark eyes, lively and intelligent, not hollow or sad, seeming to take them in with a look of mild, amused interest. It was the look a host might give a welcome, if unexpected, guest. This moment challenged every expectation Alex had carefully constructed over the course of their journey. Hauntings were meant to be traumatic, born from pain and anchored by suffering. They were echoes of the worst moments of a life, forever trapped in a loop of their own agony. But the cavalier defied this taxonomy. His presence was not an echo of a single terrible event, but a continuation of a personality, a spirit defined not by how he died, but by how he had lived. He was not trapped, he was residing. The locked doors opening and the sound of his laughter were not symptoms of distress, but expressions of a character too vibrant to be silenced by death. He was a ghost of joy, a spectral celebration of life itself. For a long, silent minute, the living investigator and the dead cavalier regarded one another in the quiet hallway. There was no communication, no phantom sound or movement, only this shared, silent acknowledgement across the centuries. Then, as smoothly and silently as he had appeared, the cavalier began to fade. His form lost its solidity, the vibrant colors of his doublet softening, his features blurring into transparency. Within a few heartbeats he was gone, the cold spot vanishing with him, leaving only the ordinary air of the corridor and the lingering psychic impression of his friendly, eerie presence. Alex let out a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. The encounter had been brief, but its impact was profound. It highlighted a stunning variety in the world of spirits, proving that the afterlife, if it existed, was not a monolithic state of sorrow, but a spectrum as diverse as life itself, capable of holding not only tragedy and terror, but also wit, warmth, and the enduring echo of a well-lived life. The scent of roses arrived first, a phantom perfume that bloomed in the still, cold air of Fyvie Castle's stone stairwell. It was not the cloying sweetness of decay, but the fresh, vibrant fragrance of a summer garden, utterly out of place in the Scottish castle's ancient, dusty interior. For Alex, the sudden olfactory ghost was a hook that sank deep, an immediate and intriguing contradiction. This haunting was not announced by sorrow or terror, but by beauty, a fragrant prelude to a story of a cursed marriage and a spectral bride forever bound to the turret room where her life had unraveled. After the cheerful cavalier of East Riddlesden, this new presence felt like a different shade of passion, one twisted by betrayal and sealed by a dying curse. The legend of the Green Lady was a tale of broken vows and aristocratic cruelty. In the 17th century, the beautiful Laird of Fyvie's young wife, Dame Lilias Drummond, was allegedly starved to death in a turret room by her husband, who coveted her lands and wished to marry another. With her final breath, she was said to have carved her name into the stone windowsill, a silent, desperate accusation. Her spirit, forever clad in the green gown of her namesake, never left the castle, a restless presence haunting the stairwell and rooms where her life was stolen. She was a ghost of vengeance and profound loss. Her story a stark reminder that the most beautiful houses could hide the ugliest secrets. Alex felt the shift in atmosphere the moment they entered the oldest part of the castle, the air growing heavy and still, the cheerful sounds of guided tours fading into a muffled distance. The grand sweeping staircase, known as the Wheel Stair, was her domain. As Alex ascended, a series of sharp, localized cold spots made themselves known. It was not a general chill, but a precise, biting cold that seemed to cling to specific steps, as if marking the path of a spectral ascent and descent. The laser thermometer confirmed the anomalies. Pockets of air 15 degrees colder than their surroundings, with no draft from arrow-slit windows or ancient stone to explain them. These were not the playful chills of the Cavalier's Hall. They were the frozen footsteps of a tragedy endlessly retraced. The scent of roses intensified on a small landing halfway up the stair, coiling around Alex with an almost tangible presence. It was here, surrounded by the impossible fragrance and the biting cold, that the personal moment arrived. Turning to look back down the stairwell, Alex's breath caught. Hovering in the center of the dimly lit space below, a faint, luminous mist began to form. It was the color of moss and sea glass, a swirling, ethereal green that pulsed with a soft, internal light. It had no defined shape at first, merely a coalescence of colored vapor, but as Alex watched, transfixed, it seemed to pull itself upward, stretching into a vaguely humanoid form, a tall, slender column of shimmering green light. It was the Green Lady, not as a solid apparition, but as an essence, a visible manifestation of her lingering spirit and the vibrant life that had been so cruelly extinguished. The mist lingered for only a handful of seconds, a silent, beautiful, and heartbreaking vision in the castle's gloom. Then, as softly as it had appeared, it dissolved, the green light fading back into the ordinary shadows of the stairwell. The scent of roses lingered for a moment longer, a ghostly farewell, before it too vanished, leaving behind only the ancient smell of stone and dust. The cold spots, however, remained, a permanent, frozen testament to her presence. Alex stood alone on the stairs, the vividness of the experience burning in their mind. They had not just documented a haunting, they had felt its perfume, seen its color, and stood in its frozen footprints. The story of the Green Lady was no longer a legend in a guidebook. It was a vivid sensory memory, a personal encounter with a beauty forever tinged with the cold, sharp edge of betrayal. Some ghosts do not haunt with the fury of a storm or the sorrow of a dirge, but with the quiet, persistent rhythm of a metronome, a life measured in footsteps and the turn of the seasons. The Grey Lady of Gawthorpe Hall was such a spirit, a creature of routine and memory, her presence a soft grey whisper in the grand Jacobean manner. For Alex, arriving at the hall in the damp Lancashire air felt like stepping into a well-ordered dream after the vibrant, emotional spectres of Fyvie and Craigie Knowes. Here, the haunting was not one of passion or artistry, but of quiet duty, an eternal, spectral caretaker forever pacing the corridors she had once called home. The hall itself was a masterpiece of symmetry, and carved oak, its sharp gables and mullioned windows standing in stern dignity against the overcast sky. The story of the Grey Lady was not one of a grisly death or a tragic romance, but of a life of service. She was believed to be the ghost of a former housekeeper or a spinster aunt, a woman whose entire world had been the orderly running of this great house. Her death had changed nothing. She was still seen, a pale, indistinct figure in a dove-grey gown, gliding through the long galleries and along the upper corridors, her presence marked by a sudden, profound chill and the soft, measured tread of her footsteps on the polished floorboards, a spectral inspection that never ended. As Alex explored the hall, moving from the grand wood-panelled Great Hall to the more intimate family rooms, the tales of the staff wove an atmosphere of respectful familiarity. They spoke of her not with fear, but with a kind of fond resignation, as one might speak of a reclusive, elderly relative who kept to her own routines. She was part of the fabric of the house, a feature as constant as the carved newel posts on the staircase or the heraldic glass in the windows. In the library, a volunteer pointed out a particular armchair that was always found slightly askew each morning, as if someone had been sitting in it long into the night. In the long gallery, another described the sensation of a cool breeze and the faint scent of lavender that would sometimes pass by, a fragrant ghost of the linen and herbs she would have once overseen. It was in the upper corridor, a long, oak-panelled passageway lined with portraits of stern-faced Shuttleworths, that the atmosphere shifted. The air, which had been still and slightly warm, grew abruptly, piercingly cold. It was a dry, deep cold that seeped into Alex's bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the draughts from the ancient windows. They stood perfectly still, the hairs on their arms rising, and then they heard it, the clear, unmistakable sound of a footfall on the wooden floor. It was not a heavy tread, but a light, precise step, the sound of a practical, sensible shoe. Then another, and another, pacing a slow, steady rhythm from the far end of the corridor, moving closer with a calm, unhurried purpose. The sound was utterly real, a crisp percussion in the silent hall, yet the corridor remained visibly empty. Alex's gaze swept the length of it, from the closed door at one end to the window seat at the other, but there was no one there. Only the sound, a phantom walker on an endless patrol. The footsteps passed within a few feet of where Alex stood frozen, the cold intensifying as they did, carrying with it a wave of concentrated memory, not of a single traumatic event, but of 1,000 ordinary days of dusting and ordering, of quiet solitude and unwavering responsibility. Then the footsteps continued down the corridor, their sound gradually fading until the hall was once again wrapped in silence, the cold slowly retreating like a tide. In the profound quiet that followed, a moment of deep reflection settled over Alex. The Grey Lady was not trapped by a moment of agony or a peak of emotion. She was anchored by the entirety of her life, by the mundane, beautiful and heartbreakingly human routine of simply being. Her haunting was a preservation of memory itself, a testament to the fact that a spirit could be defined not by how it died, but by how it lived. The endless pacing was not a punishment, it was a choice, a continuation of the identity she had forged in life. The chill and the footsteps were not a cry for help, but a gentle, persistent reminder that every life leaves an imprint, and that some echoes are so deeply woven into a place that not even death can unravel them. The hall was not merely haunted, it was remembered, and the Grey Lady was its eternal, faithful keeper. The most chilling screams are not those that shatter the silence, but those that have been echoing for centuries, sewn into the very tapestry of a place until they become part of its atmosphere. For Alex, stepping into the haunted gallery of Hampton Court Palace was like walking into the lung of a giant that had drawn a single terrified breath nearly 500 years ago and had never managed to exhale. The gallery was not a dark, crumbling corridor, but a magnificent 60-foot-long processional route, its walls hung with priceless Tudor portraits, its ceiling a masterpiece of carved and gilded oak. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the intricate patterns of the floor tiles. It was a space of immense power and beauty, but beneath the opulence, a deeper, darker current flowed, the raw, desperate energy of a final, futile plea for mercy. The story was one of the most famous in English ghost lore, a stark narrative of royal injustice. Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of Henry VIII, young, vivacious, and accused of adultery, had been arrested and confined to her rooms. Knowing her fate was sealed, she had broken free from her guards and run, screaming for the king, down this very gallery, hoping to plead for her life at the chapel door where he was at mass. She was caught, dragged back, and later beheaded. Her ghost, it was said, reenacted that desperate flight, her spectral form gliding down the gallery, her screams forever trapped in the wood and plaster, a permanent record of a moment of pure human terror. Alex moved through the gallery slowly, the weight of its history pressing down. The portraits of Tudor monarchs looked on with painted indifference, their eyes seeming to follow the path of the long-dead queen. The air was still and warm from the afternoon sun, yet a thread of something colder, something sharp and ancient ran through it. Setting up the equipment felt almost sacrilegious, an intrusion into a very private, very public tragedy. The digital recorder was activated, its red light a tiny modern eye witnessing a Renaissance nightmare. The EMF meter remained quiet, but the atmosphere was electric with a different kind of charge, the residue of a primal emotion so strong it had transcended time. Then the air changed. The gentle warmth receded, replaced by a creeping, localized cold that seemed to flow down the center of the gallery, a river of frigid air following an unseen path. It was the cold of despair, a sensation that went beyond temperature to touch the soul. And then the sound began. It started as a whisper, a faint, high-pitched keen that seemed to vibrate in the bones more than the ears. It grew, coiling out of the silence, resolving into the unmistakable, heart-stopping sound of a woman's scream. It was not a single shriek, but a continuous echoing wail of pure, undiluted terror, the sound of someone running for their life, their voice tearing with the effort. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the carved cherubs on the ceiling, from the faces in the portraits, from the very stones underfoot. A profound sense of despair washed over Alex, so potent it was a physical force, a weight that threatened to buckle their knees. This was not the sorrow of the weeping woman, or the artistic passion of the opera ghost. This was the raw, animal fear of a trapped creature, the agony of a life being brutally, unjustly extinguished. The screaming was not a random paranormal event, it was a recording of a historical moment of supreme injustice. A crime perpetrated by absolute power against a helpless individual. The gallery was not merely haunted, it was a crime scene, and the victim was still screaming. The phantom cries seemed to rush past Alex, a wave of sound and cold moving toward the far end of the gallery, toward the chapel door. For a few seconds the air itself seemed to shimmer with the force of the passing spirit, a distortion of light and energy that hinted at a fleeing form, a swirl of Tudor skirts, a flash of terrified eyes. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The screaming ceased, cut off with an abrupt, chilling finality. The cold dissipated, and the warm, sunlit atmosphere of the gallery returned. The only evidence of the encounter was the pounding of Alex's own heart and the deep, aching sense of wrongness that clung to the air. Standing in the sudden, ordinary silence, Alex understood the core of this haunting. It was not about a ghost, but about a verdict. Catherine Howard's spirit was not trapped by grief, but by the sheer, violent injustice of her fate. Her eternal scream was not a plea for help, but an accusation, a permanent protest against the tyranny that had ended her life. The experience tied all the threads of Alex's journey together, the sorrow, the terror, the artistry, the secrets. But here, in the opulent gallery of a royal palace, the haunting was stripped to its most essential form. It was the echo of a voice that power had tried to silence, a scream for justice that history itself had been forced to remember. The dead could not speak, but in places like the haunted gallery, their silence was a roar. The lake at Hever Castle was a mirror of polished jet, its surface so still it seemed to hold the grey English sky captive. For Alex, standing on its grassy bank, the air was heavy not with the threat of storm, but with the weight of a singular, infamous history. This was not a place of anonymous sorrow or collective agony, but the girlhood home of Anne Boleyn, the queen who had lost her head for love, for ambition, and for failing to bear a son. Her ghost was not one of many. It was the star performer in this tranquil, tragic theatre. The legends spoke of her being seen most often here, by the water, a pale, restless figure gliding beneath the willow trees or standing silently by the moat, a silent sentinel to the life that was so brutally severed. After the raw, screaming injustice of Hampton Court, this quiet, dignified setting felt like the calm after the executioner's axe had fallen. Alex's research had painted a portrait of a complex woman, intelligent, witty, and fiercely determined, whose rise and fall had changed the course of a nation. Her ghost, however, was often depicted as a figure of pure tragedy, a silent mourner for the daughter she had left behind and the life she had been denied. But as Alex delved deeper into the accounts, a more nuanced theme emerged: betrayal and legacy. Anne's haunting was not just about her death, but about the betrayal by the husband who had once moved heaven and earth to possess her, and the legacy of the daughter, Elizabeth I, who would become one of England's greatest monarchs. Her spirit was caught between the man who destroyed her and the child who vindicated her, an eternal prisoner of her own complicated history. Walking the castle grounds, Alex felt the past as a palpable presence. The Tudor gardens were immaculate, a geometric tapestry of green and colour, but the beauty felt formal, restrained, like a smile that did not reach the eyes. The ancient yew hedges, trimmed into severe shapes, stood like silent witnesses. Alex paused by the moat, its dark water reflecting the castle's fairy tale facade of towers and timbers. This was where Anne was most frequently reported, a solitary figure against the water and stone. The air was cool and carried the clean scent of damp grass and distant rain. It was peaceful, yet a profound sense of melancholy hung over everything, a sadness as deep and still as the lake itself. Moving away from the moat and toward a secluded copse of trees that bordered the larger lake, the atmosphere grew more intense. The cheerful sounds of other visitors faded, swallowed by the dense foliage and the absorbing quiet of the place. Here, the air grew colder, the temperature dropping in a way that felt personal, focused. Alex was reading a placard about the castle's history when a sensation, sharp and undeniable, pierced through their concentration. A cold pressure settled on their left shoulder, the distinct, firm impression of a human hand. It was not a vague chill, but a defined five-fingered grip, heavy and real through the fabric of their jacket. The cold was not of ice, but of marble, ancient and sorrowful. A jolt of adrenaline shot through them, spinning around, their heart hammering against their ribs. Alex expected to find a tour guide or another visitor, but the path behind them was empty. The copse was deserted, yet their shoulders still tingled with the ghost of that icy touch. And then their eyes were drawn to the edge of the lake, where the willow trees trailed their fingers in the black water. A figure stood there, half hidden in the dappled shadow of the branches. It was a woman, her form shimmering with a faint silvery luminescence. She was dressed in the rich dark gown of the Tudor court, a French hood covering her dark hair. She stood with her back to Alex, her posture not one of weeping, but of proud, resolute observation, gazing out across the water as if surveying a kingdom she had helped create but was never allowed to rule. The themes of betrayal and legacy crystallized in that silent, spectral form. Here was the woman betrayed by a king, by courtiers, by history itself, yet whose bloodline had produced the Virgin Queen. Her presence was not a wail of pain, but a silent, powerful assertion of her existence, and her consequence. She was a ghost, yes, but she was also a mother, a queen, and a pivot upon which history had turned. The cold hand on the shoulder felt less like a warning and more like a claim, an acknowledgement from the past, a touch from a history that was still alive. The figure by the lake did not turn, did not beckon. After a moment that stretched into eternity, she simply dissolved, fading into the pattern of light and shadow beneath the willows, leaving behind only the memory of her proud, sorrowful stance and the lingering icy brand on Alex's shoulder, a ghost's handshake, a silent testament to a legacy forged in betrayal and sealed in blood. The haunting of Athelhampton House announced itself not with a whisper or a chill, but with a violent, percussive crash from the floor above. It was a sound of splintering wood and shattering porcelain, a domestic apocalypse that tore through the manor's dignified silence. For Alex, standing in the grand hall with its soaring timber roof and stained glass windows, the sudden explosion of noise was a jarring return to the raw, physical side of the supernatural. After the silent, sorrowful dignity of Anne Boleyn's ghost, this was chaos incarnate. Athelhampton was not haunted by a person, but by a force, a poltergeist, an entity of pure, undirected energy that expressed itself through the violent manipulation of the physical world. This was not a ghost to be understood through its story, but one to be documented through its destructive wake. The great Tudor manor, set amidst pristine gardens in the Dorset countryside, was a picture of order and heritage. Its history was long and layered, a tapestry of family fortunes and quiet lives. But one thread in that tapestry was knotted and frayed, the legend of a simian ghost, a spectral ape that was said to haunt the grounds, and the more pervasive, well-documented poltergeist activity that plagued the house, particularly the Great Chamber. The phenomena here were not apparitions or emotional echoes. They were events. Furniture rearranged itself overnight, pictures flew from walls, and voices, guttural and indistinct, were heard arguing in empty rooms, a phantom domestic dispute with no visible participants. Alex's methodology shifted here from empathetic observation to active documentation. The equipment was set up with a forensic focus, motion-activated cameras were positioned in the Great Chamber, sensitive microphones were placed to capture any auditory phenomena, and the EMF meter was monitored for the erratic spikes often associated with such violent energy. The current owner, a pragmatic woman who had inherited the house and its problems, spoke of the activity with a weary familiarity. She described waking to find heavy oak chairs stacked precariously in the center of a room, of hearing the sound of a grand piano being played in the dead of night when the room was locked and empty, and of the constant, unsettling sensation of being watched by something that was not intelligent, but was intensely, physically present. The initial hours of the vigil were deceptively quiet. The Great Chamber, with its magnificent oriel window and elaborate linen fold paneling, was still and cold. Alex reviewed the historical accounts, tales of previous residents and staff who had been driven to distraction by the relentless activity. Then, a soft scraping sound began from the corner of the room. A heavy, carved chest, which had sat unmoved for decades, judging by the dust patterns on the floor, shuddered. Then, with a grating noise that set Alex's teeth on edge, it slid a full foot across the polished wooden floor, as if pushed by an invisible, immensely strong hand. The motion was slow, deliberate, and utterly impossible. The camera's red light glowed, a silent witness to the defiance of physics. Later, as Alex was adjusting a microphone, a new sound emerged from the fireplace, a deep, guttural whisper layered over itself like two people speaking at once. It was not a language Alex could understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It was an argument, a snarling, hateful exchange of sounds that crackled with malevolent energy. The words were indistinct, but the emotion was clear, a seething, mindless rage that seemed to vibrate in the very stones of the hearth. The digital recorder captured it all, a chilling audio log of a dispute between unseen entities, a conversation from a void. It was during a solo circuit of the ground floor, a few hours later, that the poltergeist turned its attention directly to Alex. They were moving down a narrow, stone-flagged corridor, that led to the service quarters. The beam of their flashlight cutting a path through the deep shadows. The air was still and cold. They paused before a heavy oak-planked door, one that led to a disused pantry. As they reached for the iron latch, the door suddenly slammed shut with a force that was like a thunderclap in the confined space. The impact was so violent it shook the walls, and the sound was a physical blow against Alex's eardrums. But the terror was not in the sound. It was in the timing. It was not a random event. It felt like a response. A personal, targeted reaction to their presence, their investigation, their very intention to open that specific door. The slam was not the settling of an old house. It was a warning, a territorial statement from the unseen force that ruled the shadows of Athelhampton. A jolt of pure, undiluted fear shot through Alex, so potent it left them breathless, their heart hammering against their ribs like a trapped bird. They stood frozen, staring at the solid, unmoving door, the echo of the slam still ringing in the silence. This personal scare, this direct and violent interaction, reinforced the most unsettling truth about poltergeist hauntings. They were not predictable, sorrowful echoes of the past. They were chaotic, intelligent in their malice, and utterly unpredictable. The force in Athelhampton House did not want to tell its story, it wanted to assert its dominance. It was a haunting that operated on pure, disruptive instinct, a reminder that the other side was not always a place of sorrowful spirits or artistic souls, but could also be a reservoir of raw, mindless power, capable of reaching across the veil not to communicate, but to shove, to slam, and to terrify. The unpredictable nature of the haunting was its true horror, a chilling demonstration that some ghosts were not echoes of people, but storms in the shape of them. The silence within the ruined library of Combermere Abbey was not empty, but layered, a deep and sonorous quiet that seemed to have absorbed the whispered prayers and chanted liturgies of centuries. For Alex, standing amidst the skeletal remains of oak bookshelves and the dust of forgotten psalters, the atmosphere was one of profound sanctity, a peace so potent it felt almost solid. Yet, beneath that peace, a current of something else flowed, a watchful, ancient presence that tinged the holy silence with an undeniable eeriness. This haunting was not one of tragedy or terror, but of devotion so absolute it had outlasted the monastery itself, a spiritual echo that refused to fade even as the stones around it crumbled. The history of Combermere was a chronicle of faith and dissolution. Founded in the 12th century as a Cistercian abbey, it had thrived for 400 years as a self-contained world of prayer and labor, its monks tending the land and their souls in equal measure. The Reformation had shattered that world, the abbey dissolved, its lands seized and its brothers scattered. The great church was plundered for stone, and the monastic buildings were left to decay or were converted into a private estate. But according to local law, one monk had never left. His spirit, forever bound by his vows, was said to still walk the ruins, particularly the library, where he had once copied manuscripts, his presence marked by the sound of Gregorian chanting and the fleeting sight of a robed, shadowy figure moving through the arches. This spiritual theme resonated with Alex on a level deeper than the previous hauntings of violence or sorrow. Their entire quest was, at its heart, a spiritual one, a search for evidence of something beyond the material world, a challenge to the finality of the grave. The idea of a ghost defined not by a traumatic death but by a lifelong faith was a fascinating paradox. Was this monk trapped by his devotion, or was he still practicing it, his eternal vigil a form of worship that transcended death itself? The peace of the place was palpable, but it was the peace of a graveyard, beautiful and solemn, and haunted by the memory of the life it once contained. Moving through the roofless nave of the old church, Alex felt the shift from the mundane to the numinous. The sun shone through empty window frames, casting long, cross-shaped shadows on the grass-grown floor. The air was fresh and clean, yet in the corner of the old chancel, a sudden deep cold pooled, a cold that felt old and reverent, like the air in a crypt. It was here that the first sound manifested. It was so faint at first that Alex thought it was the wind humming through a crack in the masonry, but it steadied, resolving into a low, rhythmic monotone. The single, sustained note of a Gregorian chant. It was a single voice, deep and resonant, chanting a phrase from a Latin psalm. The sound had no discernible source. It seemed to emanate from the very air, a vibration from the past, a pocket of auditory memory playing on a loop. Following the ethereal sound, Alex moved into the more intact section of the ruins, the old library. Its vaulted ceiling was mostly gone, but 3 of its walls stood, their stone shelves empty and gaping. The chanting was clearer here, the Latin words almost distinguishable, a ghostly liturgy being performed for an audience of 1. The atmosphere was thick with a peaceful yet eerie presence, a feeling of being in a sacred space that was both abandoned and intensely occupied. The peace was not comforting, it was demanding, requiring a stillness of soul that was difficult to achieve with a heart hammering in anticipation. And then he was there. A shadow, deeper than the others, detached itself from the gloom of a far archway. It was the silhouette of a man in the long flowing robes of a Cistercian monk, the hood drawn up, obscuring any face. The figure did not walk so much as glide, a silent, dark smudge moving parallel to the ruined bookshelves. It paused, and for a moment, the chanting seemed to emanate directly from it, the deep, sonorous notes. Swelling slightly before fading back to their previous ambient level, Alex stood transfixed, not by fear but by a sense of awe. This was not a frightening apparition. It was a solemn one, a spirit utterly absorbed in its eternal round of prayer. The monk's apparition lingered for a minute, a solid patch of devout darkness in the sun-dappled ruin, before it turned and seemed to pass through the solid stone of the far wall, vanishing as silently as it had come. The chanting faded with it, the last Latin syllable hanging in the air for a moment before the natural sounds of the world, the rustle of leaves, the call of a distant bird, rushed back in to fill the void. The profound, eerie peace remained, however, a tangible residue of the encounter. Alex slowly lowered their camera, realizing they had not even attempted to take a picture. The moment had felt too sacred, too private, to be captured by a lens. The monk's apparition had added a new, profound depth to the spiritual theme of their journey. It was a haunting that spoke not of death's horror, but of its mystery, not of a life interrupted, but of a faith so complete it had become eternal. The monk was not a lost soul. He was a found one, his spirit a testament to the idea that some devotions are so powerful they can stitch a soul to a place forever, creating a haunting not of despair but of everlasting, peaceful and deeply eerie prayer. Some houses are haunted by their past, others by their future, by the lives that were never lived within their walls, the echoes of a destiny that was promised but never fulfilled. Woodchester Mansion was such a place, a breathtaking ornate Victorian Gothic masterpiece that stood frozen in time, a symphony of stone that had never reached its final crescendo. For Alex, navigating the winding lanes of the Gloucestershire Valley to find it, the mansion's appearance was a shock. It was not a ruin, nor was it a preserved relic. It was a phantom, a near-complete shell of a house that had been abruptly abandoned mid-construction in the 1870s and left to the elements, its grand rooms open to the sky, its intricate carvings slowly being reclaimed by moss and ivy. The air of profound incompletion was a haunting in itself, a palpable sense of a purpose forever suspended. The story was one of ambition and mystery. The mansion was the vision of William Lee, a wealthy, devout Catholic who had poured his fortune into creating a grand family home. Yet, for reasons lost to time, financial trouble, family tragedy, or simple loss of heart, the work had simply stopped. The builders had downed their tools and walked away, leaving behind the sawn timber, stacks of unused stone, and the ghost of a home that was never to be. The local legends spoke not of a specific ghost, but of the haunting of unfulfilled purpose. The mansion itself was the spectre, and its phenomena were the phantom sounds of the construction that had never been finished. Stepping through the gaping doorway into the grand entrance hall was like walking into the ribcage of a fossilized leviathan. The scale was immense, the vaulted ceiling soaring overhead, but it was open to the elements, with patches of sky visible where slates should have been. The floor was bare stone, littered with the droppings of pigeons and the dust of a century and a half, The air was cold and damp, carrying the scent of wet stone, rotting wood, and the faint metallic tang of rusting tools left where they had fallen. Alex moved slowly, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space, the sense of being watched not by a person, but by the house itself, by its silent, yearning ambition. Then the sounds began. It started as a faint, rhythmic tapping, like a hammer gently striking stone, coming from the unfinished servant's wing. It was a small, precise sound, the work of a craftsman focused on his task. Alex stood still, listening, the rational mind scrambling, a woodpecker, a loose piece of metal tapping in the wind. But there was no wind, and the sound was too regular, too deliberate. It was joined by the soft, grating scrape of a saw moving through wood, a sound that seemed to emanate from the skeletal timbers of the first-floor gallery. Then, the distant, hollow clang of a hod carrier dropping a load of mortar, a sound that echoed up from the basement levels. These were not the sounds of a decaying building, they were the sounds of a building being born, a phantom construction site forever trapped in the moment of its own cessation. A profound feeling of being observed intensified, prickling the back of Alex's neck. It was not the malevolent stare of the innkeeper or the sorrowful gaze of the weeping woman. This was a collective observation, the feeling of dozens of unseen eyes, the ghostly laborers, the stonemasons, the carpenters, all pausing in their eternal, unfinished work to watch the lone living soul intruding upon their suspended dream. The air grew thick with their silent attention, a psychic pressure of collective anticipation and frustration. They were not building for themselves, but for a family that had never come, for a life that had never begun. And their watchfulness was a question posed to the void. Why did you stop? Moving up the grand, unsupported staircase, a marvel of engineering that led to rooms with no ceilings, Alex felt the haunting of unfulfilled purposes resonate with their own quest. This mansion was a physical manifestation of a life interrupted, a future cancelled. It mirrored the core of their own grief, the sense of a shared future with their sister that had been brutally aborted. The phantom hammering and sawing were like the echoes of their own unanswered questions, the desperate, repetitive noise of a reality that refused to accept its own incompletion. The mansion was not haunted by death, but by the life that was supposed to have been. Its empty windows looked out not on a world it had left behind, but on a world it had never been allowed to join. In the echoing silence between the phantom construction sounds, Alex understood that the most profound hauntings were sometimes not of lives ended, but of lives that had never truly been allowed to begin. The haunting began not within stone walls, but beneath a canopy of ancient, gnarled oaks, their branches weaving a latticework against the grey Kentish sky. Pluckley did not offer a single haunted house, but an entire landscape steeped in ghost lore, a village where the veil between worlds was worn thin as gossamer. For Alex, arriving in this place reputed to hold a dozen distinct spectres felt like stepping into an open-air asylum for the dead. After the profound architectural sorrow of Woodchester Mansion, this diffuse, pervasive haunting was a different kind of challenge. Here, the phenomena were not confined to rooms or stairwells. They drifted on the breeze, they hid in the ditches, and most unsettlingly, they whispered from the woods. The village was picturesque, a postcard of half-timbered cottages and rose-clad fences, but its beauty was a mask. Local lore spoke of a screaming man who haunted a roadside ditch, a phantom coach that rattled down narrow lanes, and a spectral schoolmaster who forever searched for his lost pupils. Yet, it was the stories of the trees that captivated Alex most, the old oaks and yews in Derringwood and along the Greensand Way that were said to murmur with the voices of the dead. They were not merely witnesses to the hauntings, they were participants, their rustling leaves forming words, their shadows hiding faces, their very presence a conduit for the other side. It was an organic, living haunting, one that shifted with the wind and the light. Walking the path into Derringwood, the atmosphere changed instantly. The cheerful sounds of the village faded, replaced by a deep, absorbing silence. The air grew still and heavy, saturated with the damp, earthy scent of leaf mold and decaying bark. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy, casting the forest floor in a perpetual green-tinged twilight. Alex moved slowly, their senses stretched taut, listening. At first there was only the normal rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth, and the distant call of a bird. Then a new sound threaded its way through the natural noises, a soft, sibilant whisper, too faint to discern words, that seemed to come from the gnarled trunk of a massive oak to their left. It was not the wind. The air was perfectly still. This was a vocal sound, a collective murmur of many faint voices speaking at once. Alex raised their recorder, the device's microphone seeming to pull the whispers from the air, capturing the unnerving audio of the trees themselves seeming to speak. The sound seemed to follow them, drifting from one tree to another, a mobile, whispering audience tracking their progress. A sudden, sharp cold spot bloomed around a particular yew tree, its twisted branches looking like frozen agony. The temperature plummeted 10 degrees in the space of a single step, a cold that was damp and earthy, the chill of the soil itself. The laser thermometer confirmed it, a pocket of frigid air clinging to the ancient tree, a permanent scar of cold in the heart of the wood. A profound and personal sense of being followed intensified with every step. It was not the intelligent, focused stalking of Berkeley Square, nor the territorial anger of the innkeeper. This was different, a pervasive, environmental awareness, as if the entire forest was watching, its countless leaves acting as eyes, its roots as ears. The feeling was of being a tiny, transient organism in a vast, sentient entity that had stood for centuries, observing generations of the living and the dead with the same silent, ancient patience. The whispers coiled around Alex, sometimes sounding like frantic, overlapping conversations, other times like a single, desperate plea for attention. They were the voices of Pluckley's countless ghosts, their stories, distilled into a susurrus that the trees had absorbed and now endlessly repeated. The experience became intensely personal through these sensory details. The chill was not an abstract reading on a device. It was a physical shock that seeped through their jacket, raising goosebumps on their arms. The whispers were not just recorded sounds. They were a constant, psychic itch at the edge of hearing, a maddening attempt to listen to a conversation just out of reach. The feeling of being watched was a physical pressure, a weight of silent observation from the encircling trees. This was not a haunting to be analyzed from a safe distance. It was one that entered through the pores, that coiled around the ankles with the cold, damp air, and that spoke directly to the primal fear of being alone in a wood that is very much not empty. The trees of Pluckley did not just house ghosts, they were their voice, and in the deep, whispering silence of Daring Wood, Alex felt the village's many tragedies, not as individual stories, but as a single, mournful breath exhaled by the land itself. The shadow of the law is long, but the shadow of the judge who perverts it is an eternal stain, a darkness that seeps into the very grain of the wood and stone. For Alex, the journey to the Skirrid Mountain Inn in Wales felt like a pilgrimage to the source of a particular kind of haunting, one not of personal tragedy, but of institutionalized death, of justice twisted into a ritual of execution. The inn, nestled at the foot of its namesake mountain, was one of the oldest in Wales, its low, timber-framed structure leaning with the weight of nearly 1,000 years. Its history was a palimpsest of lives and deaths, but one layer stood out in stark, brutal relief, its use as a court and the adjacent overhang of its oak beam as a gallows. Here, a hanging judge had once presided, a man whose name was lost to time, but whose spectral presence was a cold, hard knot of remorse and rigid authority. The inn's current owner, a woman with a quiet, solemn demeanor, shared the history not as a ghost story to thrill tourists, but as a grim inheritance. Upstairs, in the room that had once been the court, over 180 people had been sentenced to death for crimes ranging from sheep stealing to minor dissent. The sentences were carried out immediately. The condemned led to the oak beam in the stairwell, a noose thrown over it, and their life extinguished in a matter of minutes. The judge was said to have been a merciless man, his gavel falling with a finality that brooked no appeal. His ghost was the most persistent, a figure often seen in a dark, old-fashioned judicial robe, his face a mask of stern condemnation, forever reenacting the moments that had damned so many, and, perhaps, damned himself. As Alex climbed the narrow, creaking staircase to the former courtroom, the air grew thick and difficult to breathe. It was not a smell, but a sensation, a constriction, a tightening around the neck as if an invisible noose were being gently, inexorably drawn closed. It was a psychosomatic reaction, the rational mind knew, a response to the knowledge of what had happened here, but the feeling was undeniably, physically real. A pressure built in Alex's throat, a phantom rope biting into flesh that was not there, a visceral memory of the terror every condemned person must have felt on these very steps. Reaching the top, they had to pause, swallowing hard against the inexplicable tightness, the weight of centuries of judicial murder pressing down. The room itself was small, low-ceilinged and dark, the original timber beams black with age. A sense of profound gravity filled the space, a heavy silence that seemed to judge the very act of intrusion. Alex set up their equipment with a reverence usually reserved for a tomb. And then the sound began. It was not a loud noise, but it was impossibly clear in the hushed room. The sharp, definitive crack of a gavel striking wood. Thwack. It was a sound of absolute power, of a life being legally ended with a single strike. It came from the corner where the judge's bench would have stood. Thwack. It came again, a percussive, heart-stopping sound that had no physical source. The digital recorder captured it, each strike a stark audio snapshot of final judgment. The sound was not angry or manic. It was procedural, cold, and terrifying in its bureaucratic finality. Standing in that room, feeling the noose-like tightness around their own neck, and hearing the phantom gavel fall, Alex was plunged into an exploration of justice and remorse. This was not the personal vengeance of a murdered queen or the sorrow of a lost love. This was the haunting of a system, of a man who had wielded the power of life and death as a matter of course. The remorse was not a wailing grief, but a deep, frozen regret, the kind that calcifies a soul. The judge was not screaming for forgiveness. He was repeating his crime, the moment of sentencing, over and over, trapped in the instant where his authority had been absolute and his mercy absent. He was not haunted by how he died, but by what he had done while he lived, his eternity a relentless courtroom where he was both the judge and the condemned, the gavel's fall a perpetual punishment for a career of death. The experience was a chilling lesson in the weight of judgment and the long, cold shadow cast by a life spent delivering sentences without compassion. The wind on Bodmin Moor did not whisper, it howled, a raw, untamed voice that spoke of forgotten tracks and desperate men. It was a sound that had guided lost travelers to their doom and concealed the illicit movements of smugglers for centuries. For Alex, standing before the hulking, isolated form of the Jamaica Inn, the wind felt like the breath of the place itself, a vast, predatory exhalation carrying the salt of the sea and the chill of the grave. This was not a haunting of genteel sorrow or artistic passion. This was a haunting of greed and its bitter consequence, a curse woven from brandy, secrecy, and the cold steel of a cutlass. The inn, a stark granite block against the brooding moor, was a monument to a time when the line between profit and peril was as thin as a moonbeam on a cloudy night. The history was a brutal ledger of contraband and violence. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the inn was the notorious hub of Cornwall's smuggling trade, its cellars a labyrinth of hidden tunnels and secret compartments where kegs of brandy and bolts of silk were stored away from the excise men. The men who operated here were not romantic rogues, but hard, dangerous individuals who thought nothing of murder to protect their lucrative secrets. The legends spoke of a curse born from a particular act of betrayal, a smuggler killing his partner for a larger share of the spoils, his dying victim swearing that the inn would never know peace. The ghosts here were not of wronged lovers or lost children, but of these ruthless men, their spirits forever stalking the corridors, their footsteps a heavy, booted rhythm of paranoia and unfinished business. Inside, the low-beamed ceilings and thick stone walls created a claustrophobic atmosphere, swallowing the sound of the howling wind outside into a dense, watchful silence. The air was cold and carried the faint, lingering scents of old tobacco, damp wool, and something else, a briny, oceanic tang, as if the ghosts had carried the smell of the coves indoors with them. Alex moved through the main bar, its dark wood and leaded windows feeling more like a fortress than a pub. The feeling of being observed was immediate and intense, but it was not a single, focused gaze. It was a scattered, shifting attention, as if multiple pairs of unseen eyes tracked their progress from the shadowy corners and the dark recesses of the inglenook fireplace. As night deepened and the inn settled into an eerie quiet, the phenomena began. The first sign was the sound of footsteps. They were not the light, spectral tread of the grey lady or the cheerful step of the cavalier. These were heavy, deliberate footfalls, the sound of men in sturdy sea boots pacing the floorboards of the empty room above. The steps were slow and measured, a patrol of eternal vigilance, sometimes pausing directly overhead as if listening, before resuming their restless circuit. Alex's recorder captured the clear, unnerving rhythm, a sound that spoke of men who could never rest, forever guarding a treasure that had long since turned to dust. Then, the shadows began to move. In the periphery of Alex's vision, dark shapes would flit from one doorway to another, human-like silhouettes that dissolved into the deeper gloom when looked at directly. They were not the defined apparitions of Fyvie or Heaver. They were fleeting, furtive glimpses of the inn's spectral inhabitants, shadows that carried the predatory energy of men used to moving in darkness, their forms hinting at tricorn hats and the bulky shapes of heavy coats. One such shadow seemed to solidify for a moment at the end of a corridor, a tall, broad-shouldered outline that stood blocking the way, before melting back into the darkness. A silent, territorial warning. The culmination of the fear came in the cellar. Descending the narrow, worn stone steps was like entering the belly of a stone ship. The air was frigid and damp, the ceiling oppressively low. This was the heart of the smuggling operation, where the contraband was hidden and, according to legend, where the murder had taken place. The sense of greed and its consequence was palpable here, a thick, psychic residue of stolen wealth and spilled blood. Alex's flashlight beam danced over rough-hewn stone and empty, dusty alcoves. As they moved deeper, a wave of pure primal dread washed over them, so potent it felt like a physical blow. It was the fear of being trapped, of a deal gone wrong, of a betrayal in the dark. The air grew so cold it burned the lungs, and the feeling of being surrounded by hostile, unseen presences became overwhelming. In that moment, crouched in the freezing, lightless cellar, the themes of greed and consequence were not abstract ideas. They were a terrifying reality. The curse of the Jamaica Inn was not a story. It was a living, breathing atmosphere of paranoia and remorse. A moment of profound fear that tied the past's violent avarice directly to the present's chilling dread, proving that some profits came with an eternal, terrifying price. The sound of a child's laughter is a bell that rings in the heart, a pure, untainted note of joy that can light up the darkest of spaces. For Alex, hearing that sound echo through the low-ceilinged, timber-framed rooms of the Fox Inn was a disorienting, bittersweet shock. After the grim, adult horrors of smugglers and hanging judges, this haunting felt like stepping out of a thunderstorm and into a sunlit nursery. The inn, a cozy establishment in the heart of a sleepy Sussex village, was the picture of rustic charm, its whitewashed walls and flower-filled window boxes belying the poignant, playful spirit that resided within. But beneath the innocent melody of the laughter, a thread of profound unease wove itself through the air, a reminder that even the most joyful echoes can be born from loss. The legend was a simple, heartbreaking one. In the 18th century, a young boy, the son of the innkeeper, had fallen ill with a fever and died in an upstairs room. His short life had been filled with the simple pleasures of the inn, playing with a set of carved wooden soldiers on the hearthrug, chasing a leather ball down the corridors. His spirit, it was said, had never left his favorite play place. He was not a sorrowful ghost, but a playful one, his presence marked by the sound of his gleeful laughter and the mysterious movement of his old toys. He was a ghost of childhood itself, forever preserved in a state of innocent wonder unaware or unconcerned with the fact that his playtime had become eternal. Upon entering the Fox Inn, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming, smelling of ale, wood smoke, and roasting meat. The current landlord, a jovial man with a kind face, confirmed the tales with a fond, if slightly wary, smile. He spoke of the laughter, most often heard in the early evening, a sound that would drift down the staircase, or from a seemingly empty corner of the snug. He showed Alex a small wooden box kept behind the bar, containing the very toys associated with the ghost, a set of chipped soldiers, a spinning top, and a little wooden cart. He recounted how, on quiet mornings, he would often find these toys arranged in elaborate scenes on a table in the upstairs corridor, as if the boy had been playing there just moments before. Alex set up their equipment in the small, low-beamed room where the boy was said to have died. It was now a guest room, furnished with a simple bed and a heavy oak dresser. The air was still and carried a faint, sweet scent, like sugar biscuits and clean linen. The initial readings were normal, the EMF meter silent, the temperature stable. Then, as the last of the evening light faded from the small window, the first sign manifested. A soft, rhythmic clicking sound began from the corner of the room. On the dresser, one of the small wooden soldiers, which Alex had left lined up in a neat row, began to tremble. Then, with a series of tiny, precise clicks, it pivoted on its base, turning a full 90 degrees to face the center of the room, as if called to attention by an unseen commander. A moment later, the laughter began. It was not a faint or ghostly sound, but robust and full of life, the unmistakable gurgling chuckle of a young boy. It seemed to come from the hallway just outside the door, a burst of pure, unadulterated joy that was utterly at odds with the knowledge of its source. A wave of unexpected warmth and happiness washed over Alex, a reflexive response to the infectious sound. They found themselves smiling, the weight of their long, grim journey momentarily lifted by this simple, spectral expression of delight. The digital recorder captured the laughter, a stark, beautiful contrast to the whispers and screams that filled its memory. But the joy was not pure. As the laughter faded, a deep, poignant unease settled in its wake. The bittersweet tone of the haunting became painfully clear. This was not just a ghost. It was a child, a life cut off before it had truly begun, forever trapped in a loop of play, never to grow, to learn, to live. The moving toys were not just a phenomenon, they were a tragedy. The laughter was the echo of a voice that should have aged, that should have been telling stories to his own grandchildren by a fireside, not echoing forever in the corridors of an old inn. The mix of joy and sorrow was a potent, conflicting cocktail, leaving Alex feeling both uplifted and heartbroken. This haunting stood out from all the others. It held no terror, no anger, no profound sorrow. It was a pocket of preserved innocence, a beautiful, heartbreaking snapshot of a life suspended. It was a reminder that the other side was not a monolithic state of pain, but a spectrum that could hold even the pure, simple joy of a child at play. Yet, that very purity was the source of the unease, for it highlighted the ultimate tragedy of any death, especially a young one. The theft of a future, the silencing of a laugh that should have echoed for decades, not centuries. In the quiet that followed the phantom child's laughter, Alex felt a profound sense of peace, but it was a peace tinged with the deepest, most tender kind of sadness, a bittersweet acknowledgement of a light that had been extinguished far too soon, but whose warmth, miraculously, had never completely faded away. The legend of the land is older than any castle's stone, a story written not in mortar, but in the very contours of the earth itself. For Alex, the final destination in the chronicle of haunted houses was not a building at all, but a vast, chalk-carved hill in Wiltshire, where the ghost of a rider and his pale steed were said to gallop through the vales of time. The Uffington White Horse, a sleek, abstract figure scraped into the turf over 3,000 years ago, was the anchor for a tale that predated kings and castles, a haunting as old as the soil and as boundless as the sky. After the intimate, contained sorrows of manor houses and inns, this spectral event felt elemental, a force of nature and history combined, a final grand echo to conclude the symphony of spirits. The research was a dive into deep time and deeper mystery. The white horse was a Celtic creation, a symbol of a goddess, a tribal banner, its origins shrouded in the mists of prehistory. But the ghost story that had grown around it was more specific, if no less ancient. Every 7 years, as the old tales told, on the night of the winter solstice, a spectral rider, mounted on a horse as white and gleaming as the chalk itself, would appear, galloping the length of the hill figure before vanishing into the star-dusted darkness. He was not a king or a soldier, but something more primal, a guardian, a harbinger, or perhaps simply a memory of the first person to ever behold the completed horse, his awe so immense it had bound his soul to the place for eternity. Arriving at the site as the sun began its slow descent, Alex felt a shift in the very quality of the air. The wide, open landscape of rolling downland was breathtaking, the sky a vast, domed canvas of shifting cloud and light. The white horse itself, viewed from the opposite ridge, was a stunning, almost alien sight, a symbol of immense power and antiquity. But as Alex climbed the path toward the figure, the grandeur of the view was replaced by a more intimate, unnerving sensation. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze in the valley, picked up, whipping across the open hillside with a low, mournful keen. It was a cold, clean wind, carrying the scent of wet grass and cold stone, a wind that had blown across this same hill for millennia, hearing the same ghost story repeated in 1,000 different tongues. Standing on the edge of the immense chalk figure, Alex felt a profound connection to the past, a sense of scale that made their own quest and personal grief feel both insignificant and eternally part of a larger tapestry. They set up their equipment on a flat outcrop of rock, the tripod legs shaky on the uneven ground. The plan was to wait, to listen, to see if the legend would deign to manifest for a modern skeptic on a night that was not the prescribed solstice. The light faded, painting the sky in streaks of violet and deep orange, and the temperature dropped sharply. The wind grew stronger, its mournful keen evolving into a sharper, more insistent sound. And then they heard it. Faint at first, a rhythmic vibration more than a sound, a tremor that traveled up through the soles of their boots. It was the unmistakable, distant thunder of a single horse at a full gallop. The sound grew, not from the path or the valley below, but from the hill itself, from the very belly of the land. It was a deep, earth-shaking percussion that resonated in Alex's bones, a heartbeat from a time when the world was young and magic was woven into the fabric of reality. A gust of wind, colder than any they had ever felt, a wind that seemed to blow from a different age, swept across the hill, tearing at their clothes and stealing the breath from their lungs. It was the wind of the rider's passage, the frozen air displaced by a phantom charge. The hoofbeats reached a crescendo, a storm of sound that seemed to originate from the center of the white chalk horse itself. In the failing light, for a fleeting, heart-stopping second, Alex saw it, a shimmer in the air above the ancient symbol, a coalescence of moonlight and mist that formed the shape of a powerful, galloping steed, its coat the color of bleached bone, its mane and tail flowing like liquid silver. Astride it was the dim outline of a rider, leaning low over the horse's neck, a fusion of man and mount in a single, desperate, eternal ride. There was no face, no details, only the essence of motion, of a journey that had no beginning and no end. Then, as suddenly as the vision had appeared, it was gone. The thunderous hoofbeats faded into the wind, the unnatural cold retreated, and the hill was once again just a hill, silent but for the natural sigh of the evening breeze. In the profound quiet that followed, Alex did not feel fear or triumph, but a deep, resonant sense of completion. They had come seeking proof of life after death, and in 24 houses, they had found echoes of every facet of the human experience: love, betrayal, artistry, justice, terror, and joy. But here, on this ancient hillside, they found something more. The eternal rider was not just a ghost, he was a legend, a story that had been breathed into the land itself. His haunting was not about a single life, but about the enduring power of story, the human need to mark the land and people it with spirits, to see our own mortality reflected in the endless cycles of the earth. The hoofbeats and the cold wind were not merely phenomena, they were the land remembering the stories told about it. The legends endured, because they gave meaning to the silence, a shape to the unknown. They were a testament to the fact that what we leave behind is not just the echo of our lives, but the stories we inspire. The house stories were concluded, but the greater story, the human dialogue with the mystery of death, was endless. As Alex packed their gear for the final time, the vast, star-dusted sky overhead felt not like a void, but like a page, and the silent, chalk-carved horse below was a sentence in a language older than words, a permanent, spectral statement that some rides never end, and some stories are truly eternal. There are hauntings that announce themselves with a scream, a scent, or a sudden, biting cold, but the most insidious are those that manifest as an absence, a patch of moving darkness that drinks the light and offers nothing in return but a deep, formless dread. For Alex, arriving at Blickling Hall in the flat, Norfolk landscape felt like stepping into the pages of a Gothic novel, where the horror was not in what was seen, but in what was missing. The grand, symmetrical Jacobean house, with its sprawling wings and manicured gardens, was a masterpiece of order and proportion, a world built on reason and lineage, yet, in its long, straight corridors, something unreasonable lurked, a shadow that defied the sunlit logic of the architecture, and whispered of a void that the human mind could not comprehend. The legend was not one of a specific, named ghost with a tragic backstory, but of a presence, a shadowy, man-shaped figure that stalked the corridors of the oldest wing. The staff and previous visitors spoke of it in hushed, uncertain tones. It was not the sorrowful lady in the tower, another of Blickling's spectres, nor the headless Anne Boleyn, said to return to her childhood home. This was different. This entity had no history, no face, no story. It was simply a moving darkness, a thing of pure negation that glided through the halls, its passage marked only by a pervasive, sinking feeling of dread that clung to the air long after it had passed. It was a haunting of the unknown, a reminder that some presences were not echoes of the past, but inhabitants of a perpetual, unsettling present. Walking the long, portrait-lined gallery on the first floor, Alex felt the oppressive weight of centuries of watched lives. The painted eyes of the Hobart family seemed to follow their progress, their gazes stern and judgmental. The air was still and warm, smelling of beeswax and aged varnish. But as they turned into a narrower, less frequented corridor that led toward the library wing, the atmosphere shifted. The cheerful light from the tall windows seemed to dim, not with cloud cover, but with a thickening of the air itself. A profound stillness descended, a silence so complete it felt like a physical substance, muffling the sound of their own footsteps. This was the corridor where the shadow was most often reported, a straight, unadorned passage of dark wood and pale plaster that seemed to stretch on just a little too long. A wave of pervasive dread washed over Alex, so sudden and potent it was dizzying. It was not the sharp spike of fear from a slamming door or a sudden apparition. This was a slow, cold seep of despair, a feeling of profound insignificance and unease that seemed to ooze from the very walls. It was the emotional signature of the shadow, a psychic residue it left in its wake. The air grew cold, a deep, dry chill that had no source, and the light from the sconces seemed to weaken, their glow unable to penetrate the growing gloom at the far end of the passage. Alex's heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm of primal warning. They were not just in a haunted place, they were in the territory of something that defied categorization. Then they saw it. At the very end of the corridor, where the shadows were deepest, a patch of darkness began to coalesce. It was not merely an absence of light, it was a positive darkness, a solid, human-shaped void that seemed to absorb the dim illumination, creating a blacker-than-black silhouette against the dark wood paneling. It was tall and broad-shouldered, a man-shaped cutout from the fabric of reality. It did not move, but simply stood, a sentinel of nothingness, its formless presence radiating an intense, focused malevolence. This was no sorrowful spirit or playful ghost. This was a thing, an entity whose very existence felt like an affront to life itself. A cold terror, colder than the air, gripped Alex's heart. The urge to flee was a screaming instinct in every nerve, yet a morbid, investigative fascination held them. Rooted to the spot, they watched, breath held, as the dark shape began to glide. It did not walk, it slid, a smooth, silent motion that carried it along the center of the corridor, its form unwavering, its featureless face pointed forward. It moved with a purpose that was utterly alien, a destination in mind that belonged to a geography of shadows. As it passed the midpoint of the corridor, the feeling of dread intensified into a nearly unbearable weight, a suffocating sense of being in the presence of the absolute unknown. The shadow continued its silent, gliding progress, passing within 20 feet of where Alex stood frozen. It offered no sound, no cold spot beyond the general chill, no shift in the air. It was pure visual and psychic phenomenon, a darkness that moved with intent. For a few seconds, it was the only thing in the world, a walking void that consumed all light, all sound, all hope. Then, it reached a junction in the corridor, and without pausing, turned the corner and was gone. The oppressive dread lifted with its departure, the air in the corridor warming several degrees almost instantly, the light from the sconces seeming to brighten back to their normal level. Alex stood alone in the suddenly ordinary corridor, their body trembling with the aftershock of the encounter. They had not seen a ghost of a person, but a ghost of an idea, the terrifying concept of an intelligence without identity, a presence without a past. The experience served as a chilling coda to the symphony of spirits they had witnessed. It emphasized that for all the stories, the sorrows, and the passions they had documented, the true nature of the haunting phenomenon remained, at its core, a profound and terrifying unknown. The shadow in the corridor of Blickling Hall was not an answer to the mystery of death. It was the mystery itself, given form, a dark shape moving through the world, reminding all who saw it that some shadows are cast by no light at all. The final page of the journal was not a conclusion, but an opening. A door swung wide on a world Alex had once dismissed as shadow and superstition. The van, now a vessel of memories rather than a chariot of skepticism, sat silent in the driveway of their own quiet home, its tires caked with the soil of 24 haunted landscapes. The journey was over, the data logged, the recordings catalogued, but the true transformation had occurred not in the files and folders, but in the silent seismic shift within Alex's own soul. The rigid framework of scientific materialism, once an unshakable fortress, now lay in ruins, its walls dismantled brick by the touch of a phantom hand, the sound of a child's laughter, the sorrow in a weeping woman's eyes. The hauntings had not just challenged their skepticism, they had dismantled it, replacing cold certainty with a profound humbling awe for the vast, shimmering mystery that lay just beyond the veil of the seen world. Sitting at their desk, the weight of the journey settled upon them not as a burden, but as a mantle of hard-won understanding. The phantom nun's sorrow was no longer just a story from Borley, it was a shared pang of loss in their own chest. The brown lady's silent descent was a permanent tableau of aristocratic injustice. The tortured chorus of Chillingham was a symphony of human suffering they now carried in their bones. Each ghost, each echo, had been a lesson, a facet of the human condition reflected back from the other side. They were not anomalies to be explained away, but testimonies of love that outlasted death, of art that defied the grave, of injustices that still screamed for acknowledgement, and of simple human lives whose impressions were so deep they had become eternal. A final, personal insight crystallized from the swirling memories, tying all 24 stories together with a single luminous thread. The afterlife, if it existed, was not a monolithic heaven or hell, but a spectrum as diverse and complex as life itself. It was a realm of echoes, where the most powerful emotions, the most defining passions, and the most profound moments of a soul could resonate forever, imprinting themselves upon a place, an object, or the very air. A spirit could be defined by its love, like the weeping woman, by its art, like the opera ghost, by its joy, like the cavalier, or by its rage, like the innkeeper. It could be an anchor of memory, like the Grey Lady, or a force of chaotic energy, like the poltergeist. It could be a personal sorrow or a historical scar. There was no single truth, only a multitude of truths, each haunting a unique and powerful statement about what it meant to have lived, to have loved, and to have been torn away. This thematic unity brought a quiet, resonant peace. The desperate personal quest that had launched this journey, the search for a whisper from a lost sister in the great silence, had been answered, though not in the way they had expected. They had not found her specific ghost in any one house, but in every sorrowful echo, every flicker of enduring love, every playful spirit, they had found a reflection of her vibrant, unforgettable life. The afterlife was not a destination one could pinpoint on a map, but a continuum of which the dead were still a part, their essence woven into the tapestry of existence in ways the living were only rarely privileged to perceive. The silence was not empty, it was full of voices. One simply had to learn how to listen. Closing the journal, Alex looked out the window at the ordinary sunlit street. The world had not changed, but their perception of it had been irrevocably altered. It was a world layered with unseen dimensions, humming with the echoes of countless lives. The haunted houses were not aberrations, they were amplifiers, places where the signal from the other side was strong enough to break through. The journey had begun with a question born of grief. Are you there? It ended not with a definitive answer, but with a deeper, more comforting knowing. The dead do not speak, but they are not silent. They are in the cold spot on the stair, the scent of roses in a stone hall, the laughter in an empty room, the unwavering gaze of a portrait. They are in the stories we tell and the places we remember. They are the echoes of reflection, and in listening for them, we do not just prove their existence. We honor our own enduring connection to the beautiful, tragic, and eternal mystery of it all.